Chapter 743. The wind came from the north, but the people in the wind were heading north. The carriage circled around Shao Mountain and quietly brushed past the empty space between Yanjing and Songzhou. Just as it was about to reach the North Sea, it began to snow again at the end of February. This place was cold and different from the surrounding wilderness. The carriage was covered in a thin layer of snow. It was like black bread covered in crumbs as it slowly moved along the road in the wilderness. Wang Qinian, who was driving the carriage, wore a raincoat that barely blocked the snow. However, his eyelashes and the beard above his lips were still frozen by the snow. He looked wretched. However, his eyes, which usually appeared muddy and lifeless, appeared clear and sharp in the wind and snow. They slowly swept past the two sides of the road, not letting go of any suspicious movements. Wang Qinian was already very old, but such a heavy snowstorm still did not make him show any signs of fatigue. This old man was as thin as a monkey, but his muscles were like a kind of bone. He was full of strength and spirit. Such a long and difficult journey did not make him feel the slightest bit uncomfortable. It was only thanks to this powerful figure of one of the two wings of the Overwatch Council that he was able to continuously disguise himself along the way, make connections, and forge documents to break through the Qing court's countless inspection lines and successfully bring the carriage to a place not far from the border. Back then, he had been a great bandit who moved freely in the north of the land. Using him to make a living was very suitable. After the carriage passed through a col and crossed a small bridge over a snowy stream, Wang Qinian finally let out a breath. He knew that the carriage had already crossed the border and entered northern Qi territory. There was no longer anything that could endanger the life of the man in the carriage. Immediately after, a bitter smile rose to the corners of Wang Qinian's lips. He really didn't know what day it was and how the situation had developed to this date. They were all Qing people, yet they had to step into enemy territory to feel truly safe. Feeling the carriage beneath him shake, Fan Xian slowly woke up in the carriage. His years of professional life allowed him to clearly sense that the road the carriage rolled over was different from the road he had been fleeing on these days. Although there was no zhenqi in his body, the subtle feeling of his 36,000 pores and skin had not disappeared. He adjusted the thick sheepskin draped over his body and coughed lightly twice. He lifted a corner of the window and looked out of the carriage. He saw that the carriage was traveling on a somewhat familiar wooden bridge. Across the bridge was a similar scenery, but the aura was definitely not the same. It was winter. No matter how familiar the scenery was, it would still be different. However, Fan Xian was still able to accurately tell from the direction of the stream and the small hills on either side that the carriage was passing through Wudu. Back then, he had traveled to northern Qi as a young immortal poet. Along the way, Shaoan had come to this place. It was also here that he had seen the begonia for the first time. How could he forget? Fan Xian's face was very pale, without a trace of blood. Even his thin lips appeared dim. The injuries in his body still showed no signs of improving. The meridians that had been shattered by the emperor's finger were still riddled with holes. Without zhenqi to protect his body, the days of running and tiredness, as well as the harsh cold outside the carriage, had finally made him fall ill again. The thick sheepskin wrapped around his body. Only his head was exposed. There was a small heater in the carriage, but it seemed to have no heat at all. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and gazed in a daze at the northern Qi land on the other side of the bridge. He gently exhaled a breath of hot air and sank into deep thought. In his direct confrontation with the emperor, Fan Xian had already unleashed the peak of his strength he could reach in his life. However, he had still been destroyed by one finger. The meridians in his body had been shattered too badly. The natural zhenqi of Tianyi Dao contained in his minor circulation had been forced to scatter among his internal organs and was unable to condense. The only thing that seemed to be of some use was the mysterious little book Ku he had left him. However, the yuanqi between heaven and earth was too thin. If it continued to repair like this, it would take many years. After Wudu, not far away was the northern sea. The meridians in his body were all shattered. Fan Xian naturally thought of the begonia. Back then, the meridians in his body had all been shattered. He had completely relied on Haitong's careful care and treatment in Jiangnan. This time, his injuries were even more serious. He didn't know if Haitang had escaped from Jingdou or not. Fan Xian was not too worried about the Shadow's safety because he understood what was most similar to him. As long as they plunged into the sea of people, no matter what identity they used, they would be able to live well and safely. Furthermore, they would live well. However, Haitang and 13th Wang were different. Although the two of them were the top young warriors in the world, in the end, they had not specially studied these survival skills. Fan Xian did not know much news from Jingdo. When he was hiding in the fake mountain in the Yan Manor, old Sir Yan Ruahai would give him daily updates on the current situation in Jingdo. He knew that the emperor had already woken up. After leaving the capital, he and Wang Qinian only moved forward in silence. They took the initiative to cut off all contact with the old subordinates of the Overwatch Council and the various powers under Fan Xian's control. It was for safety. It was also part of the agreement Fan Xian and the emperor had reached. Fan Xian knew that as long as he did not die, the emperor would not act against those people. It would not be appropriate for him to take the initiative to contact them. The chilly wind poured in from outside the window. Fan Xian's narrowed eyes narrowed even more. He had not thought that the weather at the end of February would still be so cold. He couldn't help but worry about the trip to the temple in a few days. Given his weak body, how could he stand against the bone-chilling cold? Fan Xian pulled all of his hands and feet into the thick sheepskin. Tiredly and haggard, he leaned against the window and allowed the snowflakes to hit his face. Calmly, he looked at the winter woods on the other side of the bridge. He thought of the flower girl holding a flower basket standing quietly like this in the woods that year. If she was by his side at this moment, perhaps the trip to the temple would be much easier. Heaven follows one's wishes. These 4 words seemed to describe Fan Xian's current situation. Fan Xian looked at the figure that had suddenly appeared in the winter woods and the flowers that appeared in the expanse of white. He couldn't help but wonder if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Time to take your medicine. The carriage passed the wooden bridge and came to a steady stop. Wang Qinian rubbed his hands together and crawled into the carriage. He scooped a bowl of medicinal soup that had been kept warm on the stove and brought it in front of Fan Xian. Earlier, he had heard Fan Xian cough and felt worried. Fan Xian extended his hand out from the sheepskin and pointed with a smile at the winter woods in the distance outside the window. The medicine is there. What surprised Fan Xian was that 13th Wang was also waiting for him at Wudu with Haitang. In contrast to when he tried to assassinate the emperor in front of Taiji Palace, 13th Wang's silent and determined figure flashed out from behind Haitang and calmly watched the approaching carriage. The curtain of the carriage lifted and snowflakes flew in. Fan Xian looked at these 2 sworn friends and forced the corners of his lips to twitch. It was as if he wanted to smile but couldn't. In the end, he only sighed and said, I didn't think you would run faster than me. We left the capital later than you did. Haitang patted the ice off her thick jacket and sat by Fan Xian's side. Perhaps she was thinking of their encounter in Jingdo last month. The smile of reunion on the girl's face gradually faded. Calmly she said, I heard that later, because you escaped Jingdo first, the Qing court search weakened. Only then did we have a chance. Fan Xian nodded. He coughed and then said, As long as you're alive, it's good. There's no need for words of thanks between us. The Jingdo incident originally had something to do with your 2 strange teachers. If there is to be thanks in the end, you should be thanking me. Haitang sighed and looked at his pale face in a daze. Shaking her head with a smile, she said, I had thought that after this battle, you would mature a bit. I didn't expect you to still like to joke. Mature? The first 20 years of my life have long matured. With great difficulty, I've regained some of my youth. How could I abandon it? Fan Xian replied with a smile and turned to 13th Wang. After a moment of silence he asked, How are your injuries? From the moment 13th Wang entered Fan Xian's sight, Fan Xian had acutely sensed that there was something wrong with 13th Wang's body. The right arm that the emperor had killed seemed to be unable to recover. For a swordsman who was sincere and devoted to the sword to have his hand half crippled was, without question, a fatal blow. However, 13th Wang's expression did not change at all. In a quiet voice he replied, Your old man's Xueqi is too tyrannical. The meridians and muscles in my right arm have all been twisted to mush. There is no way to heal it. I tried on the road, but the effect was only so. Haitang Duo glanced at 13th Wang worriedly. Along the way, the 2 great grandmasters' favorite disciples had broken through together and were already familiar with each other. Fan Xian coughed and calmly said, Let me take a look. After saying this, 2 of his fingers were already on 13th Wang's pulse. Immediately after, one of his hands moved up like a dragon's claw. He carefully squeezed 13th Wang's weak right arm. The expression on his face grew heavier and heavier. 13th Wang was silent for a moment and then said, "I've been injured many times in my life. It's not a big deal." Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Buy some top-quality gold needles in Shangjing. Let me try." Following this, he turned around and used his fist to cover his mouth. After coughing forcefully, he panted and said, "At this point, what is there to hide between us? Teach him the method of Tianyi Dao." Haitang was silent for a moment and then nodded her head. The zhenqi of Tianyi Dao had a strange effect on repairing meridians. Although it was a secret of Qing Mountain that was not passed on, Haitang had secretly taught it to Fan Xian. Using it to save 13th Wang's swordsmanship was doable. 13th Wang abruptly raised his head. He heard some good information from Fan Xian's words. Even though he was a brave man who cared little for external things, he couldn't help but furrow his brows. "Can this injury be cured?" "Not necessarily, but we still have to try." Fan Xian closed his eyes tiredly. "At least eating shouldn't be a problem. However, if you want to return to your original realm, I'm afraid it won't be possible. I advise you to start training your left hand again right now. Your left hand is good. Back in the day, there was someone called Jing Wuming who was famous for his left hand. Of course, he hit his right hand even deeper. If you can train both hands, that would be impressive." There was a moment of silence in the carriage. 13th Wang suddenly smiled calmly and said, "Then, I'll train my left hand first. Later, when I have time, I'll train my right hand." Haitang Duo looked calmly at Fan Xian, who had his eyes closed and face pale. Countless strange emotions rose in her heart. These years, she and Fan Xian had not seen much and parted often. However, the two of them never needed many words to know each other's intentions. At this moment, Haitang Duo suddenly realized that she could not see through Fan Xian. During the battle in the royal palace in Jingdo, Haitang Duo had clearly and shockingly discovered that Fan Xian had already faintly surpassed the upper 9th level realm that people knew of. He firmly suppressed her and 13th Wang. Just by looking at how he could exchange a few blows with the Qing Emperor and injure him, one could see how terrifying Fan Xian's present strength had reached. "Have you already understood something?" Haitang asked a question that had no head or tail. Fan Xian immediately understood. He opened his eyes and shook his head. Smiling slightly, he said, "If I truly understood, I wouldn't have lost so badly in the royal palace." With these words, the three young people in the carriage sank into silence at the same time. Their thoughts seemed to return to that snowstorm in the royal palace. These three were the most powerful and promising young aces in the world, as well as the best assassin in the world. When faced with that bright yellow figure, they still appeared minuscule. Thinking of the Qing Emperor's expression that day, although the people in the carriage had successfully injured him, they still felt a glimmer of difficulty in resisting. "There is no true God in the world. The Emperor's injuries are worse than yours and mine." Fan Xian's light words broke the suffocating atmosphere in the carriage. "If I wasn't crippled, 13th Wang wasn't crippled, and you hadn't spat up 3 buckets of blood, the best choice right now would be to charge back into Jingdo." Haitang smiled slightly. She thought that only Fan Xian could think of such a daring plan. Her thoughts moved slightly. Calmly, she looked at his pale face and asked, "How are your injuries?" "Worse than 13th Wang. There's basically no chance of recovery," Fan Xian calmly described his injuries. Fan Xian calmly described his injuries and said, "However, I don't care about these things. Since I can't beat the Emperor by fighting, it's like a child who can't beat someone in a fight. It's better to go find a bigger relative. This is the eternal and unchanging method." For now, Haitang didn't understand the meaning of Fan Xian's words. The tiredness in her clear eyes faded slightly. Calmly, she asked, "The lightning in the square in front of the palace, do you know what it was?" "It was the chest." The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly. "It was my chest. Ku He and Sigu Jian have probably mentioned it to you. However, don't look at me like that. I also don't know who has the chest right now. Furthermore, don't think of the chest as too terrifying. If it really was a divine weapon, the Emperor would not only be heavily injured, he would have died a long time ago." Haitang was silent for a long time. She then asked, "There's something I don't understand. Since you and the Qing Emperor mutually restrict each other and neither wants the Qing kingdom to have internal strife, why didn't you choose to escape Jingdo and live in seclusion? Instead, you chose to take action?" Fan Xian was silent for a long time. The calmness in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. Evenly, he said. First, I wanted to prove to the emperor that I had the right to negotiate with him on equal footing. First, I had to have the courage to sit in front of him and talk to him. Second, although leaving Jingdo and living in seclusion was a way, the emperor would not want me to leave his control. Most importantly, I am not satisfied. He closed his eyes and faintly said, I could choose to be like Yilu Yun and Fei and go out to sea, no longer caring about the affairs of the world. I don't care how many people die in the endless flames of war on this land. But I am not satisfied. If no one can stop him, then in history, he will certainly be correct. This was the principle of the victor being king and the loser being in the wrong. If no one could stop the Qing emperor, then there would be no trace of Yi Qingmei's aura left in history. Chen Pingping would also be destined to become a criminal, unpardonable, and ultimately be killed by 1,000 cuts, a eunuch. Fan Xian was not satisfied with that wisp of soul from his homeland. The result of his efforts on this land was to become a vast expanse of white. Thus, he had to carry out the bravest attempt. I have to try at least once. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. Although I lost, at least I have no regrets. When I die in the future, I can always tell myself that I was brave for once in my life. The medicinal soup on the stove sizzled slightly. A wisp of medicinal fragrance enveloped the carriage. Haitang looked at Fan Xian in a daze and quietly asked, What are you going to do next? In the present situation, Fan Xian had launched a thunderous attack but still failed on the verge of success. The Qing emperor was heavily injured and lying in the palace, but in the end, he was not dead. The Qing kingdom's powerful national strength still existed. No one could face this lion head-on. For Fan Xian, if he wanted the emperor to maintain his sincerity in fulfilling his promise, he could not do anything to anger the Qing court. The path laid out in front of Fan Xian seemed to be hiding in a small mountain village and living out the rest of his life. I want to go to the temple. Are you interested? Fan Xian sent out a sincere invitation. 13th Wang's eyes lit up. Haitang Duo smiled after a slight surprise and said, Sir Wang has probably had a hard journey. I'll go drive the carriage. You know the way. Fan Xian smiled and couldn't resist coughing a few more times. Haitang didn't even turn her head. Smiling, she replied, Back in Jiangnan, you mentioned it a little. It should be in the north. From Wudu to the official road, the broad-leaved forest by the side of the road gradually became as thin as needles. Accompanied by the beautiful icicles on the trees by the side of the road, the snow-covered road led all the way to Shangjing, the capital of the northern Qi kingdom. Shangjing's old and worn city walls were also covered in snow. Although the Jiangnan area of the Qing kingdom was presumably in the warm days of spring buds sprouting, grass growing, and insects chirping, it had snowed continuously in northern Qi this year. The temperature had been unable to rise. It was still predominantly white. The bright yellow imperial umbrella was like a strange flower in the snow, blooming on top of the old city walls of Shangjing. Light snow fell on the top of the umbrella without making a sound. The northern Qi emperor and his favorite imperial concubine Li wore luxurious fur coats and stood under an umbrella in front of countless eunuchs, serving girls, and officials of the northern Qi court. They quietly watched the road in front of Shangjing. They didn't have to wait for long before a normal-looking carriage slowly drove over from the southwest intersection. The city gates of Shangjing opened wide. A group of caravans came out to receive them. The northern Qi emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and placed his hands behind his back. His slightly pale face carried an unhealthy flush. He looked at the carriage and couldn't help but gently sigh. This sigh was very suppressed. Other than Sea Lily beside him, no one else could hear it. Sea Lily was holding a tightly wrapped baby. She lowered her head and adjusted the warm towel on the baby's head. Suddenly hearing the quiet sigh beside her, the expression in her eyes was faint. She raised her head and quietly said, It's such cold weather. Why don't we have the nannies take Hong Dufan down first? Between the 11th and 12th years of the Qing calendar, the northern Qi court had maintained a rare kind of suppression and endurance toward the unpredictable situation in the south. They had only helped Fan Xian stabilize the situation in Dongyi through Shang Shanhu's mobilization of the army. The northern Qi court did not take advantage of the Qing emperor and Fan Xian's falling out to seek even greater benefits. The most important reason was that the northern Qi emperor had been seriously ill since last autumn. Even Sir Mu Peng, who had been released by the Qing kingdom and returned to Shangjing, could not immediately cure him. The emperor lingered on his sickbed for many months. He rarely even saw his officials, much less had to exert himself to manage state affairs. State affairs were basically handled by the Empress Dowager. The Northern Qi Emperor's illness lasted for many months. Fortunately, the matter of the royal bloodline, which worried the Northern Qi people the most, finally came out this year. Imperial concubine Li, who was greatly favored by the emperor, was pregnant and had successfully given birth to a princess. Perhaps because of this good news, the Northern Qi Emperor's illness gradually improved. There was no one in the Northern Qi court and people who was not overjoyed. Although Imperial concubine Li did not give birth to a crown prince, the emperor was still young. As long as there was a beginning, he could continue to give birth. This Northern Qi princess had not yet been given a proper name. The Northern Qi Emperor and Imperial concubine Li had privately given this pink and jade-like child a pet name, Hong Dufan. Although this pet name was truly unpleasant to the ears and greatly damaged the dignity of the royal family, it drew a great deal of discussion from the eunuchs and serving girls in the palace. In the end, it was still called this. Hearing Sea Lily's words, the Northern Qi Emperor furrowed his brows in annoyance. Turning his head to glance at the daughter in her arms, he said with slight anger, "These little ones are truly troublesome." Sea Lily's expression did not change, but she was smiling happily in her heart. She thought to herself that Hong Dufan in her arms had truly caused great trouble for the emperor. Fortunately, everything had passed smoothly. Suddenly, she looked resentfully at her abdomen. Her figure appeared bloated. She had played the role of a pregnant woman. However, in the end, there was no seed in her stomach. She knew very well why the emperor had braved the cold to carry the princess to the city walls to see this carriage. After the carriage entered Northern Qi territory, it had made contact with the Northern Qi court. The Northern Qi Emperor and she both knew where the carriage would go next. Furthermore, no one thought they would be able to return. The emperor probably only wanted the man from the south to be able to see this child with his own eyes before he left. On the road not far from the city walls of Shangjing, it was a different scene. The lonely carriage met with a group of merchants coming out of Shangjing. Fan Xian, wrapped in thick fur clothing, walked out of the carriage for a rare moment. He stared in a daze at the young man in front of him. A myriad of emotions rose in his heart. For a moment, the rims of his eyes became slightly wet, but he couldn't say anything. From the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar to now, 8 years had passed in a flash. The Fan Xia in front of him had changed from the pockmarked and irritating child of the past to the mature and steady young man with the air of a great merchant. At this moment, Fan Xian suddenly had the illusion that he was already old. He walked forward and tightly hugged his brother. He didn't say too much. The two of them had not spent much time together, but Fan Xian had never stopped reminding and teaching him. Their letters had also never stopped. He knew how hard it was for his brother to fight alone in Northern Qi. As the saying goes, jade cannot be made into anything without being cut. He had to bear it and endure it. Brother. Fan Xia looked at his brother, whom he had not seen in a long time, and thought of the things that had happened in Jingdo in the south. He then thought of how his brother was about to step onto a path of no return. Involuntarily, sorrow rose from his heart. Crying out loud, he said, "Father and mother are both in Danzhou. Grandmother's health is not good. If you go like this, what will we do?" That damned child. Fan Xian's heart warmed slightly, but he coughed and scolded with a smile. "You speak as if I am going to die. Father will take care of things in Danzhou. If you have time, you can go back and take a look. Show filial piety on my behalf." Speaking to this point, he sighed and didn't say anything more. Fan Xia actually knew that given the present situation, it was impossible for his brother to return to Danzhou. The emperor would not allow him to live. "Have you prepared the things I've asked you to prepare these years?" Fan Xian didn't want his brother to sink into such sorrowful emotions when they met. He forcefully changed the topic and said seriously, "This trip will be dangerous. I don't know what I will face. The things I asked you to prepare are for me to protect my life. You can't be an unscrupulous merchant." This joke was not funny, so Fan Xia couldn't laugh. He made a humming sound of agreement. Those things were all in the merchant group. The group would follow Fan Xian all the way out of the northern gate, so there was no need to take them out. The two brothers left the group of carriages and talked carefully for a while. It was about Danzhou, Jingdo, their parents, grandmother, Ruoruo, sister-in-law, and nephew. Just as they were about to part, the two brothers returned to the side of the carriages. Fan Xizha thought of something and furrowed his brows slightly. He personally carried out a heavy urn from a carriage and brought it to Fan Xian. Confused, he asked. This was sent by the great prince from Dongyi. He said it was something you repeatedly told me not to forget. What exactly is it? It's so heavy. I didn't dare to open it to see. Fan Xian's expression suddenly became serious. Shortly after, he smiled slightly. He knew that given his physical strength, he probably wouldn't be able to carry such a heavy urn. Waving his hand toward the carriage, he said to 13th Wang, who had come down, "Come, since your right arm has some strength, quickly carry your teacher." "Your teacher is too heavy. I can't carry him." With these words, everyone near the carriages froze. As for Fan Xizha, who was carrying the urn, his expression couldn't help but change. How could he have thought that he was carrying Sigu Jian's ashes? This was the remains of a great grandmaster. 13th Wang's expression also changed. He carefully accepted the urn like it was a treasure. Without another word, he returned to the carriage. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help but grumble bitterly in his heart. He wondered if he was going to spend every day with a dead person on this journey. "Why?" 13th Wang suddenly poked his face out from the carriage and asked with furrowed brows. "Your teacher told me that if I was going to the temple, I had to carry him with me." Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders helplessly. Watching the slowly departing group of carriages and Fan Xizha kneeling in the snow to send off his brother, Sea Lily, on the top of the palace walls, suddenly had a disappointment and sorrow that was difficult to hide in her eyes. She turned her head to look at the Northern Qi Emperor and faintly said, "Why doesn't he want to enter the capital?" The Northern Qi Emperor's expression was calm. With his hands behind his back, he said after a moment of silence, "Since he has a bet with the Qing Emperor, he has to be willing to lose. If he is not willing to be used by me, how could he enter the city?" He had the second brother of the Fan family prepare for a long time for this trip to the temple. Presumably, he has a plan. You don't have to worry too much. But why didn't Duo come and say a few words to us? Her present identity is Fan Xian's friend. This must be made clear to the entire world. After the emperor said this, a complicated expression flashed through his eyes. He prepared to turn and leave the top of the city walls. Suddenly, his eyes lit up with a faint satisfaction. On the departing carriages below the city walls, Fan Xian was waving his hand toward them with a smile on his face. The Northern Qi Emperor smiled slightly and was about to wave his hand in response when he suddenly realized that something was wrong. He forcefully put down his arm and sighed in his heart. Fan Xian put down his hand and sat back in the carriage. He looked at 13th Wang, who was holding Sigu Jian's ashes without letting go for a moment, and Hai Tang, who was leaning against the window and looking at the scenery of her old country. In his heart he said to himself, "Women brothers, goodbye." Usually, goodbye meant that they would never meet again. However, Fan Xian did not think so. Everyone in the world who knew of his plan all thought he was a madman and thought it was impossible for him to come out of the temple alive. However, he did not believe this. If Yi Qingmei could do it, so could he. Chapter 744. Yes, yesterday I was lamenting the lack of time, but today I have to ask for leave again. Tonight my best brother will show off his certificate to everyone, and no one will be able to escape. Up until now, I have only written about 1,000 words, so I can only apologetically ask for leave. It's still the same old saying, I still underestimate the time of the new year. Drunk, looking forward to the end of the New Year's Eve, almost a full 20 months of suffering seems to have become a wishful thinking. But this is also good, I can smash that railing, and no longer set a limit for myself. I think it will be much easier. Last night, the brother of a friend sent a text message, saying, I received it too quickly. There are ellipses at the end, I can feel something. I also think a lot, I really feel that my mentality is too rushed. I am always worried about the quality of the next few chapters. We have already endured for almost 2 years. Even if we continue to endure until we become old women, right? As long as the taste of the soup is good. Chapter 745. The wind and snow sent spring back. The spring on this land was still accumulating strength in the south. The wind and snow in the north had long strangled all of the spring in its cradle. In the north of the land, 360 days a year, wind, knives, frost, and swords pressed against each other. There was probably no spring to speak of. The wind and snow that filled the sky turned into bone-deep knives and swords. One knife to the left, one sword to the right, chopped down. The black mountain rocks that rarely showed the surface of the snow appeared deathly still because of the cold and merciless carvings of heaven and earth. This was a land of ice and snow. It was also a land of death. However, there was a row of black dots walking on the snowy plains that had been lonely for 100 years. They moved forward silently and resolutely. Occasionally, a number of dog barks pierced through the wind and snow and traveled into the distance, bringing a sense of liveliness. There were only 3 people in this group, but there were more than 60 snow dogs pulling the long sledges carrying food and equipment as they moved endlessly toward the north. It was said that these snow dogs that roamed the extreme north were the descendants of snow wolves. Only northern man people who could endure the bitter cold could tame them and make them good helpers for humans. However, the land had become colder and colder these years. Once they left the north gate, the temperature plummeted. The northern man who usually fought bare-chested in the snow, had long moved south to the grasslands in the west at all costs. The snowy plains had returned to peace. Who were these snow dogs? Wrapped in thick fur, even their heads and faces were covered in a warm fox fur coat. They wore leather boots on their feet and thick gloves on their hands. Their entire bodies were wrapped up like dumplings. Fan Xian exhaled and found that not long after the hot air left his lips, it seemed to have been frozen into snowflakes by the severe cold between heaven and earth. His face was slightly pale. Although he had secretly prepared for a number of years after he learned of the whereabouts of the temple in the 5th year of the Qing calendar, only when he truly stepped onto the snowy plains did he realize that the might of heaven and earth could not be truly endured just by being mentally prepared. It had been a number of days since they had left northern Qi's Shangjing. It had been 7 or 8 days since they had passed through the northern gate where there were not many soldiers stationed. Thinking of the soldiers on the snowy city watching them and their dogs walk into the snowy plains as if they were dead, the glimmer of a bitter smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. It looked like no one thought highly of them. He brought his finger to his lips and whistled. The ears of the 60-odd snow hounds around him perked up. They shook their heads energetically and shook off the ice and snow on their bodies. Deep Hair stood on all fours in the cold snow as if he was not afraid of the cold at all. He stuck out his long red tongue and waited for his master's next order. The wind and snow seemed to have lessened slightly. 2 people walked out of the 2 simple snow carts in front and behind Fan Xian. Haitang and 13th Wang were also wrapped like dumplings. They approached Fan Xian's side with puzzled expressions. "Let's go while the snow is still light." 13th Wang's voice passed through the layer of fur and traveled outside. It appeared to be buzzing. Fan Xian panted heavily and coughed as he replied, "Are the people behind still following us?" Haitang took off the earmuffs on the side of her leather hat, revealing 2 clean and cute ears. She listened quietly in the wind and snow for a moment. She then shook her head and said, "Looks like we've lost them." Although the wind and snow had lessened slightly, it was still difficult to hear the 3 of them talking together. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched into a smile and he said, "It's good that we've lost them. I don't want the people the little emperor sent to freeze to death on this snowy plains." Haitang didn't say anything. She only narrowed her eyes slightly and gazed toward the depths of the snowy plains in the north. That side was also a patch of white. Other than snow, there seemed to be nothing else in the world. Such a dry and boring journey seemed particularly dangerous because of the severe cold. A complicated expression rose in her eyes. They had already left the Sky Gate 7 or 8 days ago, but Fan Xian did not need to scout the way. Instead, he directly gave orders to go around the snowy mountains and icy hills. He walked silently as if he knew very well how to get to the temple. Fan Xian's injuries were too serious. It was impossible for him to scout the way. 13th Wang's right arm was not completely healed. Of the 3 of them, although Haitang's body was also weak, if there was to be a path to scout, it would be her. She didn't understand where Fan Xian got his confidence to not get lost in this wasteland where they couldn't see the sun or the path of the mountains. Other than ice and snow, there was nothing else. Fan Xian took out a bamboo knife from the snow sled behind him and carefully scraped the icicles on his leather boots. Everything depended on the details. Only by being fully prepared and considering the details thoroughly could they reach the illusory temple. In the few days since they left the northern heavenly gate, he had led the team on a detour around the snowy plains in order to shake off the team that was tailing them. Regardless of whether the Northern Qi Emperor wanted to ensure the safety of this group or follow behind Fan Xian to find the temple hidden beyond the sky and unknown to others, Fan Xian would not allow it. For one, he didn't want too many people to die in this cold. For another, Fan Xian himself didn't know what exactly existed in the temple. He had carefully hidden the location of the temple because he was worried that the things in the temple would spread to the world and bring unknown harm to this world. Since it was so, Fan Xian had to be careful. Although it's a bit cold, do we need to wear so much? 13th Wang stood in front of Fan Xian and panted. He felt that the thick leather jacket and boots on his body were a hindrance. Fan Xian was heavily injured and could not move his Xueqi to defend against the cold. However, 13th Wang and Hai Tang still had abundant Xueqi. When 9th-level aces were together, they could truly be said to be impervious to heat and cold. Fan Xian smiled and looked at him. If you can preserve as much heat and Xueqi as possible, then save some. Don't look at the cold right now. You can still withstand it, but we still have to head north. Who knows how low the temperature will be once we get there? As he said these words, he lowered his head slightly to hide the faint worry in his eyes. In the cave in the Xi Mountain in the 5th year of the Qing calendar, he had memorized every word of Shaowen's words before he died. He had also made sufficient preparations for this trip to the temple. However, he still had not thought that not even 10 days after leaving the gate of heaven, the cold between heaven and earth would already reach such a degree. It looked like the temperature now was a few degrees colder than when Xiao En and he had gone to the temple decades ago. Since the greatest difficulty is the cold, why don't we choose to leave in the summer? Hai Tang acutely discovered this problem. The attitude Fan Xian displayed was not very urgent. Since it was so, leaving in the summer seemed to be the best choice. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, "The time on the road is about 2 months. I don't know how much longer it will take to find the temple. Leaving at the end of winter and arriving at the beginning of summer is safer this way. Furthermore, I don't want to be stuck in darkness for half a year." Yes, I heard that the sky and earth at the temple are reversed. Half the year is night and half the year is day. 13th Wang nodded. None of you understand this world as well as I do, so just listen to me, Fan Xian said calmly. Fan Xian spoke calmly, but his words were filled with unquestionable confidence. When he and Dabao were watching the stars together, he had once again confirmed that this was Earth. Since it was Earth, then the North Pole had polar day and polar night. The north of this world was too cold. Not many people could step into the depths of the snowy plains, and not many could return alive. Thus, in the legends, the place where the temple was had a mysterious and unknown atmosphere. However, this kind of mystery had no effect in front of Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian took out 3 strange things from the cloth bag at his side and handed 2 to Hai Tang and 13th Wang. From now on, there will probably only be snow in our eyes. Overly monotonous colors will cause problems with our eyes. Regardless of whether you're used to it or not, you must wear these things. After speaking, Fan Xian put the thing on the bridge of his nose. It was a pair of glasses made of glass. The lenses had been painted black with some kind of paint, so they could still transmit light. Hai Tang narrowed her eyes slightly and looked at Fan Xian without speaking for a moment. She felt more and more that she could not see through him. She also didn't know what the thing in her hand was for. Was it good for the eyes? She didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she copied Fan Xian and put on the sunglasses that had appeared for the first time in this world. They had seen crystal glasses before, but they had never seen this kind of black. 13th Wang glanced at Hai Tang and hesitantly put them on as well. The 3 of them immediately became 3 young blind fortune-tellers. It looked rather comical. The 3 of them looked at each other for a moment and couldn't resist laughing. Let's hurry. In another 2 hours, we'll be setting up camp. Fan Xian took out the carefully protected pocket watch and looked at it. He then narrowed his eyes to look at the color of the sky in the wind and snow. As they headed north, it would probably be inaccurate to look at the time based on the color of the sky. He didn't know how many days this pocket watch could last in the bitter cold. A whining sound rang out. The 60 snow hounds, who had rested for a moment, perked up. Barking, they happily rushed toward the depths of the snowy plains. The silver-white fur on their bodies flowed with a wondrous movement. Fan Xian half leaned against the leather suitcase on the sleigh and narrowed his eyes slightly. He felt the ice and snow on his eyelashes coldly touch his thin skin. He couldn't help but twitch his nose. He tightened the loose buckles on his collar and cuffs, not wanting a single speck of snow to seep into his body. From the 5th year of the Qing calendar, he had learned the location and route to the temple. Fan Xian had hidden this secret in his heart for more than 6 years. He knew that it was fated that he would eventually go to the temple. However, he had not thought that it would be because he had to find Uncle Wu Zhu and because of the rupture between him and the emperor. The journey of exploration. Once there was such a direct goal, it seemed to lose a lot of beautiful feelings. The sleigh slid quickly across the flat, snowy plains. The sound of the snowhound's urgent breathing and the rustling sound of the wind and snow came from all directions. Accompanied by such sounds, Fan Xian seemed to be about to fall asleep. It was impossible for him to fall asleep. He was carefully listening to the breathing of the snowhounds to determine their state of exhaustion. During these 6 years, his younger brother, Fan Xizha, had followed his orders and prepared everything he needed to overcome the harsh cold, including food, kindling, and special tents in the snow. These snowhounds, which had been raised at the northern gate for 3 years, were Fan Xian's greatest reliance on this trip to the temple. From these aspects, it could be seen that Fan Xian was a meticulous person. He never fought a battle unprepared. In the eyes of the common people, going to the temple was as difficult as climbing to the heavens. In his opinion, as long as one was fully prepared, the temple was nothing more than a distant tourist attraction. The only thing that made him wary was the cold. The cold now was even colder than when Xiao En and Ku he had been. Back then, the Wei Kingdom had sent out an expedition of hundreds of people. In the end, Xiao En and Ku he had to eat human flesh to last until the temple appeared. Now, there were only 3 people in their group. Would they be able to make it there? Fan Xian closed his eyes, but he was not worried that he would freeze. The meridians in his body were indeed pretty much crippled. He was unable to mobilize Xueqi to protect his body. Strangely, the moment he entered this desolate and strangely cold snowy plains, he acutely sensed that the yuan-qi in the wind and snow seemed to be much thicker than anywhere else in the south. This sensitivity was due to the little booklet Master Ku he had given him before he died. Without that booklet, Fan Xian would probably not have sensed any change in the world. Why was it that the further north one went, the thicker the yuan-qi became? This was a phenomenon that Fan Xian could not understand no matter how he thought about it. In the end, it was a good thing. He half lay on the sleigh and slowly absorbed the yuan-qi ripples between heaven and earth. If the yuan-qi in the north was thicker, perhaps he would only need 2 or 3 years for the meridians in his body to be as good as new. The sleigh bounced slightly on the ice and snow. Fan Xian awoke from his empty state. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he calmly observed the wind and snow in front of him through his sunglasses. Suddenly, he understood something. Back then, the Wei Kingdom dominated the world. The emperor, who had nothing else to ask for, had sent envoys to the temple to seek the path of immortality. All of this was because of Ku He's suggestion. Xiao En controlled the tiki and vaguely knew the general direction of the temple. Among the mortals in the world, who dared to risk their lives to go forward and investigate. If Ku He had not pushed for this matter and tempted the Wei Emperor with immortality, the trip to the temple decades ago would probably not have happened. Why did Ku He have such great interest in the temple to the point that he wanted to go at all costs? Was it simply because he was an ascetic monk of Tiani Dao and served the temple his entire life? No, Ku He was a follower of the secular world. Just looking at how he had instantly reached an agreement with his imprisoned mother, Yi Qingmei, outside the temple, it was clear that Master Ku He did not have much respect for the temple. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed even more under his sunglasses. He didn't know when he had obtained the little book in Master Ku He's hands. Had he already sensed at that time that there was a problem with the yuan-qi in the north and wanted to go to the temple to take a look at the source of all these fluctuations and the truth? The wind and snow grew stronger, and the temperature dropped. The white sheep and snow foxes that could occasionally be seen had run off somewhere to hide from the bitter cold. On the desolate snowy plains, there was only this group of snowhounds pulling forward with difficulty in the wind and snow. 2 suppressed coughs came from Fan Xian's sleigh. This kind of low temperature was not something a normal person could withstand. His injuries had not healed, so it was indeed difficult for him to endure. 13th Wang, on the sleigh in front, didn't seem to hear Fan Xian's coughs. Instead, he looked forward cautiously. Suddenly, his body turned into a streak of sword light. Wearing a swollen leather jacket, he broke through the air and killed his way to the very front of the snowhound group. Viciously, He stabbed into a slightly raised patch of ice and snow. The snow hounds panicked and only calmed down a moment later. A few bold and curious snow hounds circled over and stood by 13th Wang's side with their heads lowered to sniff. They then let out a few sharp cries. The cries were very cheerful. 13th Wang held the sword in his left hand and put it back into the sheath. He looked in a daze at the pure white bear the snow hounds had dug out of the snow. This was the mission Fan Xian had given him. Along the way, he was to catch some game in case he needed it in the future. The snow hounds were very obedient. After dragging the white bear out of the snow, they didn't do anything else. Instead, they just licked their bloody mouths happily. This was because they knew that their masters would definitely leave most of the meat for them to eat. We can roast bear paws tonight. Fan Xian did not get off the sleigh. He watched as Haitang and 13th Wang tied the white bear to the sleigh and couldn't resist smiling happily. This was just an interlude. The sleigh group moved again. Under Fan Xian's whistle, they moved quickly along the icy snowy plains toward the northwest. Haitang sat on the sleigh and looked at Fan Xian's back in front of her. A glimmer of worry flashed through her eyes. She didn't know if Fan Xian's body could keep going. However, the worry in her eyes turned in an instant into confusion and deep admiration. It was rare for Haitang to admire someone in her life. Now, seeing Fan Xian calm and unruffled, confident, and calmly leading the way as if everything was within his grasp, she finally felt admiration. Why did Fan Xian have such strong confidence in reaching the temple? Why did he not seem to have any respect or fear for the temple? Was it truly as her teacher had said, that Lady Yi was truly a fairy who had escaped from the temple? So, Fan Xian going to the temple was just to go home? Not many people knew what the temple was. Fan Xian half closed his eyes and huddled in one spot, conserving his strength. Faint waves were also rising in his heart. He knew that his mother had once gone to the temple to steal something. He even knew that his closest relative, Uncle Wu Zhu, was originally from the temple. Logically speaking, he was the person with the closest connection to the temple in this world. Thus, his mentality on this trip to the temple was somewhat strange. It was as if he might discover the truth of everything, even the truth of his life. Of course, this could just be an extravagant hope. The most important problem right now was to find the temple. Back then, Ku He and Shaoan were the most powerful people on this land. Furthermore, their age and strength were at their peak. Yet, they still had a hard time finding it. Compared to them, Fan Xian had no advantage. Where exactly did his confidence come from? Knowledge was power. Fan Xian had more knowledge from his previous life than other people in this world. So many mysteries were actually just natural phenomena in his eyes. It was precisely because of this knowledge and the roadmap he had learned from Shaoan that he was not worried he would get lost. Chapter 746. I'll write slowly. Everyone, take your time to read. There's no rush. It was already nightfall. The wind and snow rose and fell. When the wind and snow moved, the whistling sound passed through the endless snowy plains and swirled up thousands of piles of snow. In the darkness, it was like a land of exile that devoured people. Ruthless and wild sounds rang out endlessly, making one's heart palpitate. When the wind and snow were quiet, heaven and earth were silent and cold. It was like a snowy sea containing a storm. Tens of thousands of li were filled with cold silver light. The boundless and deathly still snowy plains like white jade were cold to the extreme. On the unusually cold snowy plains, even if the moonlight shone down, it seemed to be frozen in an instant. Regardless of whether the wind and snow raged or the world was calm, the specks of light on the side of a high plateau could not be extinguished. Like the longing in a human's heart for the unknown, they stubbornly and resolutely waited there. The brazier in the tent transmitted a rare sense of warmth, completely blocking out the bitter cold outside. On one hand, it was because the specially made snow tent was extremely effective in keeping out the wind and temperature. On the other hand, it was because the fuel in the brazier seemed to be especially durable, and the fire was not small. Haitang Duo had already taken off the leather hat that covered most of her face. Her cheeks were as red as apples. She was squatting by the brazier boiling soup. Her brows were furrowed slightly with a hint of worry. Fan Xian, who had long crawled into his sleeping bag to the side, did not notice her emotions. They had already traveled north for a few days. The weather was growing colder and colder. Each day, they walked less and less during the day. Most of the time, they hid in the tent to avoid the snow. However, Fan Xian was not too worried about these problems. He was only calculating how long the fuel and food he had brought could last. The white bear had long been left with only a piece of bear skin. Fan Xian had eaten 2 bear paws. Although Haitang and 13th Wang were surprised at his leisurely mood and even more surprised that he had not forgotten things like seasoning in his personal equipment, the bear paws were not very tasty. Furthermore, the amount was not enough. At the beginning of the journey to the temple in the extreme north, the dozens of snow hounds laboriously pulling the equipment could still find food on their own. The deeper they went into the snowy plains, the fewer living beasts they could see. Without a choice, Fan Xian was forced to use the food he had prepared. These snow hounds worked hard every day. Naturally, Fan Xian could not bear to treat them badly. However, their appetites were a bit too good. For this trip to the temple, Fan Xian had made ample preparations. He had sunglasses to prevent snow blindness, a specially made, fine, velvet sleeping bag, and a large amount of supplies. However, he was still cautious. If he couldn't find the temple before summer and had to endure half a year of darkness on the icy plains in the extreme north, the food he brought would not be enough. Perhaps he would have to start killing dogs in the end. Back then, Ku He and Xiaoan had survived by eating human flesh. Fan Xian didn't want to repeat his mistakes. He turned his head slightly and looked at the begonia flowers by the brazier. Forcefully suppressing the piercing pain in his chest, he said, "Do you want to hear a story?" "What story?" Haitong's face was still a little red, and she didn't raise her head. Fan Xian smiled and told her the story of Xiao En and Ku He exploring the temple in the north. He didn't even hide the fact that the 2 elders had eaten human flesh. After Haitang finished listening, her expression gradually changed. It was as if, for a moment, she could not accept that her teacher had once made such a terrifying choice. A complicated emotion reverberated in her heart. After a moment of silence, she slowly raised her head and looked at Fan Xian with her bright eyes. Quietly, she said, "Telling me this at this time is certainly not just to disgust me or attack me. There has to be some reason." "I found that you like those snow hounds very much," Fan Xian said tiredly. Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly. Tiredly, he said, "In reality, these snow hounds have indeed helped us a lot. If the day comes when we run out of food and ammunition, we will have to start eating dog meat. I hope you are mentally prepared now." Haitong's expression changed slightly. In front of Fan Xian, she didn't need to maintain her identity as the Northern Qi Saint girl and the leader of Tiani Dao. She could naturally reveal her emotions. She was a girl, so she was incomparably fond of the snow hounds that ran around happily every day. During this month, she had basically been responsible for the dog food. Suddenly hearing these words, only now did she realize that Fan Xian had not had good intentions from the beginning. The snow hounds that worked hard to pull the sled were part of his food reserves. However, Haitang had already made difficult preparations for this trip to the temple, particularly after hearing about her teacher's tragic story of eating human flesh. She knew there were priorities. She lowered her head slightly and didn't reply or argue. It was quiet inside the tent, causing the sound of the wind and snow outside the tent to be especially clear. One could even hear how much snow was violently beating against the outer skin of the tent, causing the sound of pa-pa, causing one to be unable to rest in peace. At this moment, the sound of footsteps on ice and snow came from outside the tent. Fan Xian and Haitong's expressions did not change because they knew who it was. On this desolate, uninhabited, and bitterly cold snowy plains, other than these 3 youths, whose willpower and bodies were as powerful as the peak of humanity, no one else could appear. 13th Wang lifted open the wooden door and walked in, bringing with him a gust of cold wind. The flames in the brazier suddenly dimmed. This damned cold of the snowy plain seemed to be able to freeze the flames with a low temperature. Haitang took out a small black ball from her sleeve and threw it into the brazier. The fire in the brazier finally stabilized. All of this was a special item Fan Xian had prepared all these years. In particular, the fire seed had never been cut off. 13th Wang stood on the blanket by the door and patted off the thick layer of ice and snow on his body. He took down the countless layers of towel wrapped around his face. A few words as crisp as a lump of ice came out of his lips, which had turned white from the cold, and said, "All right, let's sleep." Haitang was responsible for all the trifling matters of life. This girl had finally been transformed by Fan Xian into a housewife in this extreme environment. 13th Wang was responsible for leading the dozens of snow hounds and the construction and defense of the tent. What he meant by all right was that the snow shelter specially built for the snow hounds outside had been taken care of. In terms of hard work, 13th Wang's work was even harder. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and said to him, "From tomorrow onwards, you will be responsible for feeding the dogs." 13th Wang nodded and sat by the brazier. Accepting the bowl of hot soup Haitang handed him, he slowly drank it. Each mouthful was carefully drunk. The sword at his waist dragged on the ground, giving off the faint smell of blood. To recover, you will indeed need to practice endlessly. However, this place is too cold. Don't push yourself too hard. A glimmer of worry flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. These days, 13th Wang had practiced his sword with unusual valiance in the wind and snow, using his own potential to resist the might of heaven and earth. This kind of hard practice truly moved Fan Xian and Haitang. They knew 13th Wang had a sense of urgency and wanted to quickly recover his arm or train to be left-handed. However, Fan Xian was always worried about his body. Ada found a nest of snow rabbits earlier. However, the hole was too deep. They couldn't do anything about it. I helped them chase the rabbits out. 13th Wang put down the bowl of soup and rubbed his face. Shaking his head, he said, "I also moved my muscles and bones. If it continues to freeze like this, I'm afraid I'll freeze into an ice cube." "Looks like we can improve our meals tomorrow," Fan Xian said with a smile as he covered his mouth and coughed. He found that 13th's relationship with these snow dogs was growing better and better. He was afraid that there would be one more person he needed to convince in the future. He suddenly noticed that Haitang was acting strangely. She spoke particularly little today. Furthermore, her face was always red. There was always worry between her brows. He couldn't resist asking in a quiet voice, "What are you thinking about that so engrossed?" Haitang furrowed her brows slightly and glared at him but didn't say anything. To the side, 13th Wang paused and gave a rare smile. Tying the towel around his head again, he walked out of the tent. Fan Xian was slightly startled. A moment later, he couldn't resist realizing the reason. He laughed out loud. Could a living person die from holding in their urine? These words were vulgar and just happened to hit Haitang's sore spot. A glimmer of anger flashed through the girl's eyes. Fan Xian had calculated everything. He had even calculated 2 years ago that he would drag Haitang and 13th Wang to be his helpers on this trip to the temple. He knew that the long journey and endless night would be like the days by his sickbed in his previous life. The unbearable loneliness would make one go crazy. Back then, Ku He and Sir Xiao En were able to endure until the temple appeared under the morning sun, not because they dared to eat human flesh. Rather, it was because they could become each other's companions. In a dangerous and unknown journey, companions were always the most important factor. However, Fan Xian had still missed out on some details of life. He and 13th Wang didn't care. Any jaw would be enough to relieve themselves. He had never thought of adding to the burden and preparing an extra tent on the snowy plains as a toilet with unusual luxury. Although it had been cold a few days ago, they could still withstand it. The temperature had suddenly dropped. It was difficult to relieve oneself in the wilderness. 13th Wang walked out, leaving Haitang some private space. She narrowed her eyes slightly and looked at Fan Xian coldly. "If it weren't for your medicine jar, there wouldn't be so many inconveniences." Fan Xian was silent and smiled. Of the 3 people on this trip, even his body was the weakest. If he hid in the wind and snow outside the tent, he would probably immediately be frozen into a cripple. Lightly smiling, he said, 13th Wang left alone. "Naturally, he knows the relationship between you and me. There's no need to mind who we are, right?" It was still a deep and cold night. Due to the lack of wood and other large materials, the fire in the brazier was unable to flourish. The wind and snow continued to howl furiously outside the tent. There was no danger in the darkness around them, but the cold itself was the greatest danger. The 3 sleeping bags were lined up in a triangular formation by the brazier. The 3 young people in the sleeping bags all had their eyes wide open and refused to sleep. They had already trudged on the snowy plains for a month without any entertainment or tricks to pass the time. Other than traveling, it was all about sleeping. It was truly boring. The 3 of them had also slept their fill. If Fan Xian's body was not so weak, he would certainly regret bringing 13th Wang, the sun, with him. Otherwise, holding duo and saying words of love that he hadn't said in a long time, enjoying the pleasure of their mouths and hands, would be good. After dozens of sleepless nights, the three young people had basically finished talking about everything they needed to talk about. Even 13th Wang's bedwetting as a child had been viciously dug out by Fan Xian. Thus, the three of them could only keep their eyes open and listen to the whistling of the wind and snow outside the tent as if they were enjoying a musical event. After an indeterminable amount of silence, Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "In such a windy, snowy, and bitterly cold place, when those people came here back then, most of them would have died. For the three of us to be able to withstand it is quite remarkable." Haitang, who was lying across from him, said softly, "Shizhuan was the first to open the mountain and search for the temple. He couldn't compare to you in knowing the direction and the route. Naturally, it was more difficult. But the later generations are always better than the previous generations. You seem to know more than us. Don't envy me." Fan Xian closed his eyes and smiled happily. To be able to go to different places and experience different things in one's life is in itself a rare enjoyment. 13th Wang replied, "That makes sense. Since that's the case, why don't the three of us write poems at night? In the future, the history books would say that on a snowy night, it would become a great poem. Wouldn't it be wonderful? Let me take the lead. As the saying goes, the north wind blows all night." There was nothing else. It was clear that Haitang and 13th Wang did not want to allow this person's corrosive aura to flare up. It was silent. Fan Xian coughed and smiled. "You don't give us any face. We are all rough people. If you want us to write poems with you, it's you who doesn't give us face." Besides, this line was written by Feng Lotzi in Story of the Stone. "I wrote Story of the Stone. Who dares to say that I didn't write this line?" Fan Xian's shameless voice rang out in the tent. The other two used silence to express their disdain. Fan Xian smiled and opened his tired eyes in the dusky environment. As he coughed and panted, he said, "We've said everything. We understand each other enough. However, I've always been curious. What exactly do you want to do in this world?" "I want to become a great grandmaster and then, like my teacher, protect the people of Dongyi." 13th Wang's answer was always valiant and direct, confident and normal. "A bedwetting brat does not have the right to use such kingly words," Fan Xian said. "I." Haitong's bright eyes looked at the tent above. After a moment of silence, she said, "Ever since I was young, I grew up in the back of Qing Mountain. Later, I went to Shangjing and began to travel the world. I just want to bring Qing Mountain to greater heights and protect the Qi court for generations to come, to not be invaded by foreign enemies, and for the people within our borders to live and work in peace." Her voice suddenly became gloomy. "But when Master left, I found out that I was not a Qi person, but a Hu person. I don't know what I want to do, but I think if the Qi kingdom can be safe, if the world can be peaceful, it will be good." "You are indeed worthy of being the last disciple taught by two strange old creatures. Just a casual sentence and you think of the world." Fan Xian sighed. "Actually, before I met you, I had never thought about things like good war or bad peace. Because Uncle Wu Zhu never cared about these things, I didn't care much either. I just wanted to live on well." Fan Xian's tone appeared particularly light. "The more vivid and fresh I live, the better. From the first day I became sensible, I always felt that everything around me was just a dream. There would come a day when I would wake up from this dream. This kind of feeling made me work hard and live each day seriously. It seemed that I wanted to use the richness of these details to dilute my fear of waking up from this dream." Listening to Fan Xian's leisurely words, Haitang and 13th Wang sank into silence. They thought Fan Xian was sighing about his strange past and strange life. They had no way of knowing what Fan Xian was truly sighing about. "Since you don't want to wake up from this dream, presumably, the contents of this dream are good," Haitang said comfortingly. The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. He smiled and said, "Naturally. If it wasn't to protect everything beautiful in this dream, why would I exile myself to this god-forsaken place? Why would I fight with the emperor for all this? Why would I pretend to be brave and righteous and enter the palace to assassinate? Why would I carefully maintain the stability of the Qing court? All of this, everything after his rebirth, was it truly just a dream?" It was completely silent in the tent. Haitang and 13th Wang had both fallen asleep, but Fan Xian still had not. He indifferently looked at the sky that had been cut off from them, and listened to the sound of the wind and snow whistling past outside the tent. He thought endlessly in his heart. He died in that world and came back to life in this one. During his childhood, Fan Xian could not shake off the fear of waking up at any moment. He was afraid that all of this was fake. He was afraid that he was in an illusory mental state. He was afraid that this was the Truman Show that encompassed the world. He was afraid that this was a brilliant game, and he was just a ripple of consciousness, a stream of data, or a hypnotized wooden man. True warriors dared to face true death. For Fan Xian, who had lived 2 lives, his true fear was that he didn't know whether or not he was truly dead. He was worried that once he awoke from his dream, he would once again lie on the sickbed and sink into true darkness, never to see all of this beauty again. Rivers and mountains, lakes, seas, flowers, trees, and beauties. He had yelled on the rooftop in Danzhou to collect the clothes. He had written 300 poems in the palace. All of this was based on an impudent emotion. However, after living on the land of the Qing kingdom for more than 20 years, he had laughed and cried. He could finally prove that all of this was not a dream. Although he still didn't know what the temple was, he was certain that all of this was truly happening around him and not an illusion created by some mysterious god. The people of this world truly existed. The emotions of the world truly existed, as well as human nature and sorrow and joy. There were always some things in the world that could not be faked. If there truly was a god who could perfectly control all of this, just like how God wanted light, Nuwa wanted to play with mud, or Pango wanted to rest when he was tired, then what was the point in investigating all of this? The closer he got to the temple, the more Fan Xian could not shake off these questions. It was not until the night that he gradually understood. Perhaps this trip to the temple was to ask for the answer to a question. In reality, he was still more concerned about the reality of the secular world, or at least the sorrow and joy of the lives of the people he thought were real. For things that could not be known, could not be investigated, could not be touched, and could not be observed, in reality these things did not exist. This was something that had once been taught in physics class in that world. Fan Xian had always remembered it clearly. Tonight, he suddenly felt that he could put this definition in physics onto the word fate. No one could change fate, but he could choose not to accept his fate or ignore this fate. Fan Xian lived in this world. Whether he loved or hated the people and things in this world was certainly real. It was so real that it was etched into his bones. He firmly believed in this. After a night of restless sleep, the Zhenqi in his body scattered. Although the Yuanqi in the world made up for what he lacked as he breathed, the speed was still not fast enough. The cold invaded his body, and his mind was restless. Fan Xian finally fell ill. When the whistling of the wind and snow outside stopped and the white light from the snowy ground reflected into the tent, Fan Xian's face became very pale. 2 unhealthy red spots appeared under his eyes, and his forehead was boiling hot. The sickness he was most afraid of had arrived at the coldest moment. Fan Xian lay in Haitong's warm and gentle embrace and drank the medicine he had made. He forced himself to stay awake and said in a raspy voice, "The medicine jar has something to say." "Speak." Haitong's brows were full of worry. She held him gently and shook him like she was coaxing a child. "We can't stop. Let's keep going." "But the snow here is so heavy." Suddenly, the tent door was lifted open. 13th Wang stuck his head in. His face was full of joy. Chapter 747. Violent wind and blizzard, horizontal wind and snow, slanting wind and fine snow. There was no need to return, nor could it return. It was also known as ghost wind and vicious snow, dark wind and dark snow, snow that covered the sky and covered the sun. There was also the snow that grew under one's feet, reaching up to one's knees. If one made the slightest mistake, one would probably be buried. On this day, after experiencing dozens of days of bitter cold travel, all of the snow suddenly stopped. It was as if the heavens had suddenly felt that their actions of endlessly throwing confetti into the world were childish and could not enchant the determined gazes of the 3 young people. Thus, they clapped their hands and pulled them back into their sleeves. The sky cleared, revealing a porcelain blue but still icy sky. Although the sunlight was not warm, it was piercing. Borrowing the boundless land of snow and glaciers, it reflected a white to the point of being dull in every direction. After the wind and rain, there was not necessarily a beautiful sky. It was not that there would be a rainbow when the sky cleared. Thus, Forrest Gone returned to his country and had to experience many things before he could see Jenny again. Then, he would still be thought to not understand certain things. He set off again and kept on running past countless beautiful scenes. After the wind and snow, the sleigh team on the snowy plains set off again amidst the cheerful cries of the snow hounds. Crushing the soft or firm ice and snow, they advanced north. A pale-faced Fan Xian sat on the sleigh with half his body in Haitang's arms. As he coughed, he forced his tired eyes open and stared at the terrain around him that was difficult to identify. He compared it to the map in his mind and confirmed the direction. The cold in his body was becoming more and more serious. Although he had not lost the medicine he carried with him, the harsh coldness between heaven and earth was, without question, a cruel torture for Fan Xian, who was heavily injured and had lost all of his Xueqi. Every night these days, Fan Xian nestled in his sleeping bag and always felt that his entire body was wet and cold. He coughed so hard it was as if he was going to cough out his organs. There was a raspiness in the thunder. It was like a knife grinding endlessly against a rock. No one knew when it would break. Haitang and 13th Wang were both worried about his body. They had even thought of returning to the south. However, they were stopped by Fan Xian with unusual determination and coldness. He knew that if he couldn't find the illusory temple in one go, he didn't know if he would be able to summon such courage again in his life. Furthermore, the meridians in his body were in chaos. The emperor was still recovering in the palace in the south. If he didn't go to the temple to find Uncle Wu Zhu, there was no point in him going back to the south. What gave Fan Xian even more confidence was that, through the magic booklet Master Ku he had left behind, he could clearly sense that the further north he went, the thicker the yuan-qi became. As he continued to meditate, the sea of qi behind his back gradually showed signs of stabilizing and accumulating yuan-qi. It would be a pity to give up now. For the three of them, the biggest problem was time. This was a race between Fan Xian's injuries and the distance to the temple. Fan Xian felt that if he truly found the temple, the injuries in his body would be much better. Haitang and 13th Wang both knew that under Fan Xian's gentle appearance was an incomparably stubborn and ruthless nature. Thus, they could only silently listen to his suggestion. However, these two friends were still very worried about his body, particularly when they heard waves of heart-wrenching coughs at night. Who could sleep well? In the quiet night, Haitang burrowed into Fan Xian's sleeping bag and gently rubbed his chest for him, using her body temperature to warm up the bitter coldness. Their bodies pressed gently and intimately against each other, but there was not a trace of male and female thoughts. They just held each other tightly like two little pigs warming each other up. 13th Wang noticed this, but he did not show any expression or reaction. He only increased the speed of their journey north. Leading the group of snow dogs, they took advantage of the clear sky to rush forward with all their might. How much farther? Even though the snow had stopped, there was still wind. 13th Wang, on the first sleigh, shouted against the wind. His voice quickly rang through the entire snowy plains. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at 13th Wang standing on the sleigh in front of him with his fur coat swaying in the wind. He couldn't resist smiling. He thought to himself that this kid was rather dashing. He was not afraid of the cold and could still stand on the sleigh and ride the waves of snow at this time of year. Particularly with that pair of sunglasses, he looked like the boys who played extreme sports in the other world. Taking out a compass and map from his clothes, Fan Xian coughed in Haitang's arms and carefully confirmed the position. The sleigh moved up and down endlessly on the snowy ground, making his observation a bit tiresome. After thinking for a long time, he tiredly said, "At most, 15 more days." When Fan Xian unfurled the map, Haitang turned her face. This was not the first time Fan Xian had unfurled the map. At the beginning, he had only used his powerful memory to point the way. Later on, he became too ill and had to take out the map. However, 13th Wang and Haitang would purposely avoid it. This was Fan Xian's request and the oath the three of them had made before they set foot on the journey to the temple. Fan Xian requested that Haitang and 13th Wang not reveal the location of the temple to anyone. He guessed that once the location of the temple was revealed, once the things in the temple were to fall into the mortal world, it would probably bring endless disaster. Just like the martial arts secret manuals his mother, Yi Qingmei, had brought out in the past and that chest, if there were many more in the temple, what would the world become? Fan Xian did not want the world to become a terrifying place filled with Tianqi aces and electromagnetic cannons firing everywhere. Any random fight between powerful warriors would cause the sky and earth to crash in chaos. How would the common people live? The journey was not lonely because they had companions. However, it was particularly difficult. This kind of difficulty could not be described with words. The difficulty was in the bitter cold, in the dryness, and in the endless snow-white color that seemed to never change. After an indeterminable number of days, the flat snowy plains and slightly arched snowy hills gradually became alive. The terrain began to become complicated. The sunlight grew dimmer and dimmer. The temperature dropped to an unbearable level for humans. Fortunately, the snowstorm still did not come down. On the other side of the northern horizon, a tall mountain suddenly rose. A tall snow-capped mountain. It was as if from the beginning of the world, this magnificent and mighty snowy mountain had stood there, coldly and calmly waiting for brave travelers to come and make offerings. The sleigh procession slowly came to a stop beside a relic of glaciers. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant snowy mountain in front of him. He gazed at the strange mountain glowing with a cold white light under the blue sky. A glimmer of excitement grew uncontrollably in his chest. A glimmer of excitement that came from the depths of his heart quickly took over his entire body, making his fingers tremble slightly. In his dreams, he had seen this snowy mountain that was similar to Dong Mountain. In his dreams, this snowy mountain was high and unscalable. It was mysterious, powerful, and cold, just like the feeling the emperor gave him. Now, when this snowy mountain suddenly appeared in front of his eyes without any warning, Fan Xian felt boundless joy. People were born to fear death. If one could hear the truth in the morning and die in the evening, then what kind of enjoyment would it be to be able to see a scene that no one else could see, learn more of the secrets of heaven and earth, and know the unknown that attracted the gaze of humans the most and urged them to evolve? Fan Xian's body abruptly froze. His incessant coughing also stopped. He looked greedily at the quiet and secluded snowy mountain. It was as if he wanted to firmly brand this scene, which moved him, into his heart so that he would never forget it in the years to come. He was moved not only because of this scene or the temple in the mountain. It was also because the Xueqi here had reached a level that made one tremble. The eyes on Fan Xian's pale face were sunken, and he was extremely thin. With each breath, he seemed to feel that he was gradually becoming healthier. Haitang was the first to sense Fan Xian's strangeness. Haitang was the first to sense Fan Xian's strangeness. Her body was already exhausted. Her usually bright eyes had long been ground into exhaustion by the severe coldness between heaven and earth. At this moment, her eyes lit up again. Following Fan Xian's gaze toward the snowy mountain, she did not speak for a long time. After the sledges stopped, the snow hounds seemed to sense the different atmosphere and howled in a low voice. Of the 60-odd snow hounds, after experiencing such a difficult journey, only 17 remained. The long line of sledges had been abandoned along the way and had been reduced to 5. 13th Wang stood on the one at the very front. He didn't turn his head. He only stared in a daze at the mountain. In a raspy voice he asked, "The temple is in this mountain?" "Yes." Fan Xian, who had been too tired to speak for a few days, found the strength from somewhere and spat out one word with great determination. After receiving confirmation, the 3 young people stared in a daze at the snowy mountain in the distance. It was as if they didn't want to take another step forward. Suddenly, 13th Wang jumped down from the sleigh and roared crazily at the snowy mountain. His voice was raspy, angry, and even more elated. Seeing this, Haitang and Fan Xian couldn't resist smiling. They thought that this last disciple of the Sword Hut, who had always been gentle and determined, had endured until now and finally exploded with the craziness he inherited from Sigurjian. After the laughter came silence. Haitang's eyes grew moist and finally turned into a few clear tears. The tears landed on the leather jacket and quickly turned to ice. Fan Xian shook his head happily and couldn't speak for a long time. Those who had not experienced their long journey would not be able to understand the emotions in their hearts at this moment. It was a kind of satisfaction of achieving a great wish, a kind of heroic spirit that triumphed over heaven and earth, and an impulse that was about to come into contact with the most mysterious place in the world. On the long snowy journey, the snow hounds died on the ground along the way. Fan Xian was seriously ill and could die at any moment. Haitang and 13th Wang had also been tortured until they lost their human form. Such hardships were not worth mentioning to outsiders. In the end, they had arrived. Without Fan Xian's ample preparation and understanding of nature, the 3 of them would probably have died on the snowy plains long ago. Thinking of this, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the snowy mountain in the distance. He couldn't help but think of the two powerful pioneers from many years ago, Master Ku He and Sir Xiao En. When Fan Xian and his group had set out from northern Qi, it had been early spring. Now, it should be summer, the warmest time in the world. Back then, Xiao En and Ku He's group of hundreds had set out in the summer. There were countless deaths and injuries along the way. By the time they arrived at this snowy mountain, it was the polar night. How had the two pioneers made it through the months-long polar night? Unlike Fan Xian, Xiao En and Ku, he did not have the roadmap and experience left behind by predecessors. Yet, they were still able to survive in such a wretched environment. It truly made Fan Xian, who had just escaped death, sigh in admiration. Compared to the two pioneers who ate human flesh, Fan Xian and the other two were actually much happier and more relaxed. However, they were still wretched. Fortunately, Haitang and 13th Wang were both top warriors in the world. Additionally, there was Fan Xian, a cripple with the knowledge of two lives. Everything seemed to be predestined. Fan Xian was destined to be the person in the world who feared the temple the most. He was also the person who had the most ability to enter the temple and needed to enter it. Fan Xian gradually shook off the excitement and agitation in his heart. Forcefully suppressing his emotions, he gazed calmly at the tall snowy mountain and guessed at the appearance of the large temple in the mountain. In a raspy voice he said, "Rest for the night. Enter the temple tomorrow morning." Chapter 748. Qing Yunyan. Qing Yunyan. Isn't this name meant to wish everyone a happy new year? I wish everyone that in the new year, those who should get married, those who should get pregnant, those who should get married, those who should get married, those who should get married, those who should get into a relationship, those who should get high marks in exams, those who should do business, those who should get promoted, those who should not have to worry about their superiors, those who should work, those who should get more red packets, those who are speculating in the stock market. Everything should be safe on the road. Have a good New Year's Eve dinner, and drink less alcohol. Those who write books are happy, and those who read books are happy. Those who do suddenly realize that their web novels are no longer eunuchs. Those who mingle in the forums suddenly realize that those familiar IDs are all girls. Is there anything else I missed out? I wish everyone a happy new year, and all the best. I also wish myself and Fujian Cement Company's business to become more prosperous, and I hope that they can recover their capital as soon as possible. The feeling of being cut in half is really not a good one. I won't lament about the past year, because I only have the word thank you to everyone, nothing else. I don't have to look forward to the coming year, because I will continue to write books seriously, and write stories that everyone likes and that I like, nothing else. Chapter 749. In the fog-shrouded cave in Shangjing West Mountain, Fan Xian had once told Xiao En, who was dying, that he was actually just a tourist walking in this world. He wanted to see more scenery, so he had a strong interest in the temple. Unlike the Northern Qi Emperor who wanted to use the power of the temple to unify the world, the former Wei Emperor who wanted to obtain the secret of immortality from the temple, and the Qing Emperor who used the temple as a fighter with unusual valiance, Fan Xian's interest in the temple in the past was mainly in the unknowns. Fan Xian's strong desire for the temple's secrets inevitably had more practical considerations attached to it. He needed to enter the temple and find traces of Uncle Wu Zhu to confirm his safety. He also needed to try to find a way to return to the world and defeat the Qing Emperor. These were actually only two sides of the same thing. As long as Uncle Wu Zhu was still alive, then everything would be easy to handle. In Fan Xian's understanding, there was no one in this world who could harm Uncle Wu Zhu and leave him behind. The black-shrouded young grandmaster possessed overly powerful and wondrous skills. Even if the great grandmasters who had once existed in the world worked together, Wu Zhu would probably have enough ways to escape. The problem was, this snowy mountain was the temple, that illusory fairyland that had always stood above the clouds of human society's legends. For such a place that did not belong to the secular world, even Wu Zhu was probably not a match for it. Reality seemed to prove this point. Uncle Wu Zhu had returned to the temple to search for his roots. A few years had already passed, yet there had been no news. If he had not been imprisoned in the temple, then he had probably already left this world. The morning sun did not have a glimmer of warmth. It shone coldly on the three people at the foot of the snowy mountain. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and raised his head to look at the majestic snowy mountain in front of him that seemed to cover half the sky. He watched the ice and snow reflect a jade-like glow under the morning light. He was silent for a long time and didn't speak. The 3 top young people in the world had set out from the camp when the sky was still dark. After walking for a few hours, they approached the snowy mountain with great difficulty. What shocked Haitang and 13th Wang was that Fan Xian seemed to be very familiar with the path under the snowy mountain. He led the 2 of them easily through a narrow passageway under the snowy mountain and came directly to the other side. This side of the great snowy mountain was also a plain made of ice. There was nothing but snow and ice. The 3 of them had passed through the snowy mountain and arrived on the other side. Their camp was on the other side of the snowy mountain. "Where is the temple?" 13th Wang asked between breaths, carrying Sigu Jian's urn of ashes on his back. His face, which was wrapped in cloth clothing, was frozen red. Fan Xian was supported by Haitang. He narrowed his eyes and looked up the mountain. Back then, Xiao En and Master Ku, he went up from this side of the mountain. Logically speaking, the temple should be right in front of us. However, there was nothing in front of them. There was only jade-like ice and snow covering the mountain range of an unknown color. At this moment, the wind was not strong. The sky had not sent down a snowstorm. Their field of view was vast and clear. In this clear field of view, it was impossible to find any signs of man-made carvings. Haitang, who was supporting him, was silent for a moment. She then suddenly said, "In the old legends, the temple only appears in front of common people for 1 or 2 days a year. If the temple does not want to be seen by mortals, then no matter how hard mortals search, they will not be able to find it. Legends are, after all, just legends." Fan Xian covered his mouth and coughed. The clothes he wore were very thick and could barely withstand the cold of the outside world. Speaking of which, it was rather miraculous. Presently, the temple was close at hand. Although he didn't know its location, the dense yuanqi between heaven and earth had begun to flow faster into his body, making his injuries and illness much better. With great difficulty, the coughing stopped. Fan Xian blinked his eyes and looked tiredly at the messy snow and rocks on the snowy mountain. "The legends may not be true. Back then, your teacher and Sir Xiao En endured a few months under the snowy mountain just to wait 1 or 2 days for the temple to appear. I don't know how much human flesh they ate. I don't want to wait." Fan Xian had experienced 2 lives that other people could not have, so he absolutely believed that there was the will of heaven in the unseen world. However, the education he had received in his previous life made it impossible for him to shake off his atheism. Thus, this contradiction made him feel a faint reverence toward the temple. On the other hand, he didn't really believe in the so-called legends. If the legends are not true, then there must be a trick to the temple being hidden in this snowy mountain. Haitang Duoduo's entire face was covered by her fur collar. In a droning voice she said, "If we want to search through this mountain, given our present state, it will probably take a lot of time." "I also understand. Since it will take a lot of time, then let's quickly begin," Fan Xian said in a raspy voice. He then glanced at 13th Wang. "Presumably, you have also noticed that the nights here are particularly short. After a few more days, there will probably be no nights. It will be more convenient for us to search." After many months of arduous travel on the snowy plains, Fan Xian no longer purposely hid the knowledge he knew from his previous life in front of Haitang and 13th Wang. Each of his predictions eventually became reality. However, Haitang and 13th Wang did not know the basis of his predictions. In their hearts, Fan Xian appeared more and more mysterious and unfathomable. During these months, Haitang and 13th Wang did not have a sliver of doubt or hesitation toward any of Fan Xian's predictions or orders. However, at this moment, the 3 of them stood in front of the snowy mountain and were about to begin their search for the temple. 13th Wang did not head toward the snowy mountain. Instead, he glanced at Haitang. Coincidentally, Haitang also glanced at 13th Wang. Their gazes met. They both saw the worry and shock in each other's eyes. Fan Xian noticed the strangeness of his 2 friends. Furrowing his brows slightly, he coughed and said, "What is it?" 13th Wang was silent for a moment. He then looked at him and said, "We are just curious. The temple is right in front of us. Based on your predictions, no matter how long it takes, we will always be able to find the temple before the night comes." Fan Xian nodded. He didn't understand the meaning of his words. His brows furrowed even deeper. Beside him, Haitang sighed and said, What we mean is that we are about to find the temple. Regardless of whether it is to dig out the secret of the temple or to rescue the blind great master from the temple, you have to have a plan ahead of time and make some preparations. If you have any understanding, you have to let us know ahead of time. Given your present physical condition, there are many things that require us to do. The temple was like a fairyland. At least, it was so in the hearts of the people of this land. Fan Xian and the other two were exploring the temple. This was a major event, yet Fan Xian appeared relaxed and careless. It was even a bit sloppy. It was as if he was truly just traveling. Who knew what kind of dangers were hidden on this snowy mountain, and what kind of divine might was difficult for mortals to withstand? Haitang and 13th Wang were both top figures with the most determined wills and willpower in the world. Faced with this snowy mountain, they still found it difficult to suppress a sense of confusion and fear. They truly did not understand how Fan Xian could still be so relaxed and at ease. Back then, Ku He and Xiaoan returned from the temple alive. This place is not as terrifying as people imagine. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Back then, the two of them were already superior 9th-level aces. However, they were tortured for half a year and were about to die. Their strength is not as good as we are now. Since they can return alive, what are we afraid of? Furthermore, Uncle Wu Zhu and the Emperor have both said that the temple has already fallen into ruin and has no power. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly. I believe in the Emperor's judgment because he has basically never made any mistakes in this life. Even though the temple had fallen into ruin, it was still a temple. Could mortals stop worshipping it? More importantly, I only know the way to the temple and its outer appearance. As for what is inside, I don't know either, Fan Xian said with a helpless smile. Since it is so, then it is useless to make any more preparations. Let's search. We'll talk about it after we find it. This was a very irresponsible way of doing things. Fan Xian had spent his entire life immersed in the darkness of the Overwatch Council. He never fought a battle unprepared. Even when faced with the unfathomable Emperor, he still came up with clever plans and bravely thought of little ways to win. Looking at this snowy mountain that he knew nothing about, how could he have prepared? The snowy mountain remained silent, solemn, and cold. It was as if it had no idea that three mortals were nervously and quietly searching for its secrets. The temple, which was rumored to be omnipotent and omniscient, was still like a girl waiting to be married, hidden in the wind and snow, unwilling to show its true face. After climbing up the snowy mountain with great difficulty for a long time, the wind on the mountain gradually grew stronger. It swirled up the snow on the rocks, blinding the eyes. Fan Xian's eyes remained clear and steady. He did not let go of any details that could have been missed. In his calculations, the temple only appeared for 1 or 2 days a year. The last time Xiao En and Ku He had seen the temple was the day after the polar night ended. There had to be some pattern hidden here. Only after the polar night did the sunlight fall on this snowy mountain. Did the people in the temple want to sunbathe, so they appeared? Leaning against Haitang's warm back, Fan Xian turned his head in satisfaction and sniffed the girl's neck. He was incomparably happy. He knew that his deduction was certainly correct. In the direction of the snowy mountain facing the sky, there would certainly be some man-made traces of ice and snow being broken. Haitang's brows furrowed slightly. She didn't understand where Fan Xian's confidence came from. She also didn't know why he was so happy. Reality was as Fan Xian expected. It didn't take long before 13th Wang, who was searching about 600 meters to the right, suddenly turned his head and made a hand gesture toward the two of them. In the wind and snow, it was difficult to hear clearly what 13th Wang had found. Fan Xian and Haitang could easily sense the excitement of the Sword Hut disciple. In a snowy depression, Fan Xian crouched down and carefully examined the traces 13th Wang had found. He pulled out a hole in the ice and snow and found what they had been looking for a long time, some man-made traces. It was something like a track. It was made of an unknown material. Even in such a harsh and cold environment, it was still incomparably smooth and did not deform at all. Fan Xian stood with Haitang's support and followed the track into the depths of the ice and snow until it reached the top. The wind and snow were strong. The majestic mountain range of ice and snow seemed to have suddenly snapped in the middle and sunk in. That was probably the end of the track. 13th Wang found a few other tracks beside this one. They were all made of a very high-quality material. No one knew what they were used for. The three of them immediately became nervous. There could only be one explanation for the sudden appearance of these magical tracks in this bitterly cold place that mortals would find difficult to reach. "Climb up along it," Fan Xian said in a raspy voice. Fan Xian spoke in a raspy voice. His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes were a calm that he barely managed to maintain with a valiant will. There were no paths on the snowy mountain. There was snow and wind everywhere. If one was the slightest bit careless, they would fall off the mountain and end up with their bones crushed. Fortunately, Fan Xian had brought Haitang and 13th Wang, two powerful warriors, here. Otherwise, how could a sick person like him endure the power of heaven and earth? The three of them suppressed their nervousness and faint fear and followed the smooth track. Going against the wind and snow, they climbed up the mountain range. After climbing for an indeterminable amount of time, when 13th Wang and Haitang both felt that the zhenqi in their bodies was about to be completely used up by the icy and snowy tracks, they suddenly felt their vision darken. The mountain was barren and the snow had no path. The sky darkened and the earth opened up. Fan Xian and the other two stared in a daze at the stone steps at the end of the track. They were speechless for a long time. This place was truly a work of nature. Such long stone steps were hidden on a platform deep in the mountain range. If someone could actually come to the snowy mountain, they would not be able to see these stone steps from the foot of the mountain. The temple appeared for 1 or 2 days every year. Did it mean that these stone steps would slide out along the track and bathe in the sunlight to welcome travelers who came with great difficulty to worship? These stone steps were made of green stone. No one knew how many thousands or tens of thousands of years they had experienced the baptism of ice and frost. There were many damaged areas. Amidst the ancientness, there was an ancient and frightening beauty. Different from the tracks, only when they saw these seemingly endless stone steps did the three of them truly feel like they were entering the temple. As they slowly walked up the stone steps, an indescribable atmosphere shrouded the three of them and shrouded the stone steps. The three of them maintained their silence at the same time. No matter who it was, in the moment before the mysterious veil of the temple was lifted, they would probably find it difficult to hide their excitement and fear. This was a kind of excitement and fear toward the unknown. It was human instinct. A long light gray eve appeared above the stone steps and reflected itself in their eyes. Haitang and 13th Wang's bodies froze slightly and paused. Fan Xian broke away from Haitang's support and stared at the gray eve calmly, almost crazily, as he walked toward the top of the stone steps. Under the long light gray eve was a black stone wall. Just like this, as the three of them walked, it slowly revealed its true appearance. A solemn feeling followed the temple as it emerged from the world of ice and snow and enveloped the entire world. The temple finally appeared in front of the three of them. It appeared so calmly and naturally that it made the three of them feel a trace of disbelief. They had searched for it for thousands of miles in the crowd, dreamed of it, suspected that they had entered a dream. The temple that tens of thousands of people had searched up and down for thousands of years had actually appeared just like that. They could not help but feel a strange emotion. Standing at the top of the last stone step, Fan Xian's hands outside his leather jacket trembled slightly. He looked woodenly at the temple in front of him and was unable to speak for a long time. Beside him, Haitang and 13th Wang found it even harder to suppress the emotions in their hearts. With perplexed expressions, they looked at the magnificent building. The temple was very large. At least, it was impossible to build such a grand temple with the construction skills of the human world. The tall black stone walls were like unmelting black ice that stretched in front of the three of them. The long light gray eaves extended all the way to the end of the platform above the stone steps. No one knew how many secrets of history and heaven and earth surrounded it. To be able to build such a grand temple, the platform at the end of the stone steps, hidden deep in the snowy mountains, was extraordinarily large. It was many times larger than the square in front of the Qing royal palace, which could hold tens of thousands of people. The thing that gave the three of them the most direct sense of pressure and grandeur was the front door of the temple in front of them. This door was at least 27 feet tall and immeasurably deep. Its color was a simple and unadorned dark color. The three of them stood on the stone steps. They were still dozens of feet away from the front door of the temple. Because the front door was too tall and large, it made them feel as if it was right in front of their eyes. The pressure it gave off was very powerful. It wanted to make one fall to the ground and worship endlessly. Standing on the platform in front of the temple, Fan Xian, Haitang, and 13th Wang were all the most extraordinary young people in the world. However, in this grand square in front of the temple, They were like 3 lost ants in the grass. Suddenly raising their heads and finding a large tree blocking the sun, they were shocked speechless. The only person who could maintain his calm was probably Fan Xian. After all, he had seen Jin Mao and the Three Gorges Dam in his previous life. He knew that the temple in front of him was certainly a miracle in the eyes of the people of this world. In his eyes, it was nothing more than a pretty building. It was difficult for one to see the ocean as water. It was difficult for one to see Mount Wu as clouds. In the past, Fan Xian could not explain these words to Zhuang Mohan and Sir Han. Presently, in front of the temple, Fan Xian found a new explanation. One's horizons and experience determined the height one stood at. Because he had experienced it, it was difficult to be intimidated. Fan Xian was not more outstanding than Haitang and 13th Wang. It was precisely because he had experienced a more developed civilization in his previous life that he appeared much calmer. Even so, with the temple in front of him, it was still difficult for him to suppress his nervousness. He stared fixedly at the doors of the temple in front of him and was silent for a long time. In an instant, he lowered his head and looked at the green stone steps under his feet. He thought of decades ago, when Master Ku He, whose body was already extremely broken, had used his palms to slap the stone steps under his feet and cried bitterly. Now, the 3 of them could be considered much calmer. After calming his emotions, Fan Xian suddenly raised his head. His pupils constricted slightly as he stared at the large signboard above the doors of the temple. Just as Shaoan had said in the cave, because it had been too long, what was written on the signboard could no longer be seen clearly. There were only some incomplete symbols left. In Shaoan's narration, perhaps these symbols were the mysterious decree of heaven. In Fan Xian's eyes, these symbols that had finally appeared in front of him represented an even more shocking discovery. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the only remaining Wu on the signboard, as well as the 3 symbols below it. 1 up, 1 down, 1 up, 1 down, 2 circular arcs put together. It was the entire content of the symbol. He extended his finger into the cold air and unconsciously began to move along with the symbol. Ever since the 5th year of the Qing calendar, he didn't know how much effort he had put into this Wu, and these 3 identical symbols. He had also asked Uncle Wu Zhu and Sigu Jian for guidance. After all, there was too little information, so he had come up with nothing. Now, this Wu and these symbols had finally appeared in front of him. How could he not feel agitated? Fan Xian noticed the position of the incomplete Wu on the signboard, as well as the position of the 3 symbols. A bright light flashed through his mind like lightning. It made him completely stunned. His legs seemed to be out of his control as he walked in a daze toward the doors of the temple. Haitang and 13th Wang finally awoke from their shock at seeing the true appearance of the temple. They immediately noticed Fan Xian's abnormality and nervously followed him toward the doors of the temple. Fan Xian's gaze was still locked tightly onto the large signboard as he muttered to himself. He spoke faster and faster. It was impossible to tell that he was a patient. An excited flush rose to his face. What heavenly seal! If this isn't the letter M, what else could it be? Fan Xian's tired gaze had been completely replaced by a bright light of complicated emotions. He gritted his teeth and laughed foolishly. Looking at the large signboard, he finally understood what the temple was. He finally knew that the deduction he had never told anyone was correct. The tracks in the snowy mountain were not used to transport the stone steps to the sky beyond the mountain. Instead, they were used to transport the entire temple to the sky. The temple also needed energy. It needed sunlight. That was why it had appeared in front of the people after the polar night. It was this point that allowed Fan Xian to confirm that the temple was not a miracle. It was just a building whose exact use was still unknown. More importantly, he was finally sure that the ground he was standing on was still that blue planet. It was the Earth he had once mentioned to Dabao under the boundless starry sky. Fan Xian's lips were pale. Trembling, he said to himself, "If this is the Earth, then what is this temple? 3Ms, a thing. I didn't have such a large museum at the time." Endless emotions rushed into his mind, making him feel somewhat embarrassed. His cheeks were red, his lips were pale, and his eyes were somewhat lost. Yes, the temple was just a very, very old museum. The word Wu that Shaoan remembered was not a sickle or an axe. The 3Ms were not heavenly seals, nor were they the marks of the Russian spaceships. They were just the most common letter in the English language. Yes, the large signboard of the temple clearly had the word thing, but the three M's below were the missing parts of the word. The temple was a museum. Fan Xian stood woodenly in front of the gate of the temple. Raising his head to look at the large signboard, he could not believe his eyes. If the world he was in was the earth, then when was this museum, which clearly had a history of tens of thousands of years, built? Where were the people who built these museums? Why did such an existence exist in the world? Why did this museum become the temple that people spoke of? Thinking of the vague legends in human history, the Tianmai beings, the messengers of the temple, and the martial formulas and chests that had been stolen from the temple by his mother, Yi Qingmei, Fan Xian's body trembled uncontrollably. He felt as if he had found the greatest secret of this world, but he found that there were still too many questions that he could not explain clearly. Fan Xian coughed violently. In front of the dark gate of the temple, in front of the gate that looked like a book of history, he stooped down. An angry and helpless voice rang out from his chest. What kind of F***king museum is this? This is a military museum. An emotionless voice rang out from the gate of the temple. It seemed to only want to answer Fan Xian's question, which was full of frustration and panic. Yes, the temple is a museum, and a military museum at that. When Xiao Yezi transmigrated, she could not have brought that chest with her. That chest has always been in the temple, but she stole it. I have always said that the cute Xiao Yezi is a thief. Comrade Fan Han, in the chapters of the Temple of Eternal Night, once wrote a book review. He guessed that the temple might be something, and that the symbols are the Soviet sickles and axes. Many other readers have made similar deductions, and they are all very powerful. However, from the beginning of this book, I set the temple as this because of my personal preference. I like interesting things, and that is why I am obsessed with the story. In this world, in this story, other than transmigrating, everything else needs a reason. Writing out the cause and effect is my love. Is the secret of the temple revealed just like that? No. How do I explain the secret manuals that created the great grandmasters? In the past there was a mountain, and in the mountain there was a temple. In the temple, there must be a person. The next chapter will slowly tell everyone about the origin and story of the temple. There is much more, and I have to write slowly. I have never tried to work during the new year. This year is the first time. I found that it is indeed not something a human should do, so I applied for leave. Now is the most important end of the Qing dynasty, so I will write slowly. I do not want to squeeze time to write to ensure that there are updates. That would be the worst. In the next few days, I will still not update. I think everyone is used to my laziness, so I will not say too many apologies. I earnestly flattered everyone and did not disappoint them. I bowed deeply and left the stage. Chapter 750. The wind and snow stopped. Hearing the calm voice, Fan Xian's pupils constricted. He looked warily at the heaven-like wooden door in front of him. He didn't know what kind of monster would run out from inside. After a long time, the temple in the depths of the snowy mountain remained silent. After the voice in the temple answered Fan Xian's unconscious angry question, it seemed to have sunk into some complicated thought process and sank into silence. Immediately after, the strangely large door in front of the temple silently opened a crack. When such a heavy door opened, it didn't make a single sound. It made one shiver even though it wasn't cold. The temple door opened at a 15-degree angle. From the front, one couldn't see the scenery inside. However, this silent opening seemed to indicate some kind of invitation from the person in the temple. Fan Xian's heart began to thump and then he forced it to calm down. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the shadow of the temple door. There was not a trace of expression on his face. Unexpectedly, he slowly sat down on the shallow white snow on the stone platform. He had thought that it would be like decades ago. When Master Ku he was about to open the temple door, a black shadow would come out like lightning and give them a powerful blow. However, when the temple door opened, there was not a trace of movement. Could it be that the person in the temple also felt lonely and cold? Did the person in the temple hope to see them come? The mountain of treasures was in front, hell was in front, heaven was in front, and the scene of flowers and snow was in front. It was only a short distance away, yet Fan Xian sat down. A slightly bitter smile hung from the corners of his lips. He closed his eyes and began to meditate endlessly. Haitang and 13th Wang did not understand the conversation between the voice in the temple and Fan Xian. After all, There were no museums in this world. They also did not understand why Fan Xian would sit down in front of the temple door. They stared in a daze at the open door of the temple. Nervously, they walked to Fan Xian's side, took out the weapons at their side, and began to stand guard for him. Haitong's weapon was still the soft sword at her waist. 13th Wang had found a wooden stick from somewhere. Like a hunter. His eyes stared sharply at the temple door that had opened a crack. The three of them stood silently in front of the temple gate. The yuan-qi in the surroundings was very thick. Fan Xian acutely sensed this, which was why he had closed his eyes and sat down. Before entering the temple, he had to at least ensure that he could move without hindrance. If he had to run wildly in a moment, he would at least not burden Haitang and 13th Wang. Since the temple was right in front of them and the temple doors were already open, they had waited for tens of thousands of years. Why was there a need to rush at this moment? After an indeterminable amount of time, Fan Xian slowly opened his eyes. The 36,000 pores on his body greedily absorbed enough yuan-qi to repair a great deal of the wounds in his meridians. The zhenqi accumulated at the back of his waist could finally try to slowly flow. His spirit was much better and he was ready to enter the temple. Fan Xian's eyes landed on the door of the temple. 13th Wang was also staring nervously at it. With two crisp chirps, a little bird walked out childishly from the door of the temple and chirped at the three people outside. The bird's body was green and beautiful. It gave off a sense of purity. Outside the temple, the three people looked at the bird's arrival and couldn't help but start. They hadn't thought that the person coming to the temple to welcome guests would not be some demonic immortal general, but a bird. The green bird was attentively watching. "Let's go." Haitang looked at the beautiful green bird and her heart trembled slightly. She unconsciously said this and helped Fan Xian up from the snowy ground. Fan Xian's spirit was much better. He thought for a moment and then said, "Let's go in." One temple, one world. Behind the door was another world. However, what was different from what people imagined was that behind the gate of the temple was not a beautiful fairyland. It was also different from what Haitang imagined. That green bird flew away with a chirp, and there were no more cute creatures that came to welcome the hard-working traveler. Inside the temple was a square, a very large square. There were some large buildings scattered around the square. Although these buildings were tall, they were all blocked by the black stone wall outside. The people under the snowy mountain would not be able to see them. The materials and style of these buildings, as well as their height and breadth, were not at a level that the world people lived in could reach. On the walls on either side of the path, there were traces of extremely dilapidated murals. One could still faintly see a thread of lines and some very dim colors. Fan Xian and the other two walked along the path inside the temple. Raising their heads, they saw a snowy sky. Lowering their heads, they saw a snowy ground. They only felt that the world was still so quiet. The legendary scenes and scenery around them did not seem to exist in reality. The three of them were like three little black dots walking silently along the path. The voice in the temple did not ring out again. It was as if the people in the temple did not care where they came from and couldn't be bothered to guide them where they were going. Thus, Fan Xian and the other two only walked silently and casually along the path inside the temple. Their eyes calmly observed the eaves and large stone platforms of the buildings that passed by them. They appeared normal and casual, but waves of shock had long risen in their hearts. After all, this was the interior of the temple. No one in this world had probably ever entered. The land of legend and myth had finally appeared in front of them. What kind of complicated emotions were Haitang Duo and 13th Wang suppressing under their outward calmness? Back then, Ku He and Xiaoan had only been outside the temple's door when they met the Black Shadow and Little Fairy. Fan Xian and the other two had actually walked into the temple. Fan Xian had to be calmer. He had already faintly guessed the history of the temple from the voice in the temple's reply. His gaze stopped on the remnants of the wall paintings on the two sides of the path. The paint had peeled off badly. It was impossible to see clearly what was depicted on them. The secret of history seemed to be hidden in these paintings. However, Fan Xian easily found familiar traces in the remaining lines. Just like how the architectural style of the temple had influenced the dark green royal palace in Shangjing, the style of the wall paintings in the temple and the paintings in the Qing temple and even the restaurants in Yishur Tavern all seemed to come from the same source. It looked like the temple had stood in the world for thousands of years. Although it did not enter the world, it always had a faint influence on it. The wind and snow in the temple were much lighter than outside the walls. At this moment, the wind and snow had stopped long ago. There was only a thin layer of powdery snow on the path. Fan Xian and the other two's footprints were clearly imprinted on it, turning into a lonely line that went straight into the depths of the temple. Along the way, they only saw some broken buildings on the verge of collapse and a cold and uninhabited wasteland. This place was not a fairyland or the realm of the gods. Just as the emperor and Uncle Wu Zhu had said, it was just a broken place. Fan Xian pulled back his gaze from the footprints in the snow and thought for a moment. He then continued to lead Haitang and 13th Wang forward. After entering the snowy plains, he had become the leader of the three of them. Although his injuries had not recovered and his illness had worsened, Haitang and 13th Wang faintly sensed that Fan Xian had more knowledge in certain areas than most people in the world. In front of them, the small, agile and beautiful green bird was still chirping. Appearing and disappearing, it led the three young warriors who had come to worship the temple through the thin snow. Accompanied by loneliness and silence, they walked forward. They roughly confirmed the range of the buildings inside the temple. It was a flat square. Without realizing it, the three of them had already walked to the center of the temple. In the center of the temple was a platform. Behind the platform was the most well-preserved building. Although many scars from time could still be seen on the outside of the building, the gradually eroding stone edges bore witness to the ruthlessness of heaven and earth. In the end, this building had not collapsed. Walking all the way here, they did not see a single person or the legendary emissary of the temple. There was only the green bird flying and landing on the stone platform covered in thin snow. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. He found that the green bird had landed on the thin snow but did not leave any footprints. The temple emissary did not appear. The silence of the voice confirmed another fact for him. Perhaps it was a mysterious reaction, but the three of them stopped in front of the stone platform. Looking at the green bird on the snowy platform, they were silent. It was as if they wanted to see it become a flower or bring back a flower with its mouth. After waiting for an indeterminable amount of time, the oppressive silence in the temple did not change at all. Fan Xian's movements also did not change at all. His body was slightly trembling, but his heart was trembling slightly. Along the way, the traces of the buildings they had passed actually made him nervous. He faintly felt that these buildings were the remains of a civilization left behind countless years ago. Perhaps there was some connection between them and the world in his previous life. There is no danger in the temple. Those emissaries of the temple should have all died. Fan Xian's raspy voice suddenly broke the silence that had been maintained for countless years inside the temple. The green bird on the platform turned its head and glanced at him. Fan Xian's sudden words startled Haitang and 13th Wang beside him. Ever since they had entered the temple, Haitang and 13th Wang's emotions had been shaken by the never-before-seen and never-before-heard enormous building remains and the little green bird that seemed to be able to communicate. They had long lost the calm judgment they had in the world and were perplexed. All dead. Haitang and 13th Wang had purely and unconsciously repeated Fan Xian's words. It was impossible for them to agree with his judgment. There was no danger in the temple? An illusory place that only existed in myths and legends had suddenly appeared in front of his eyes. Who could be like Fan Xian and forcefully say such a judgment? Haitang looked at the green bird on the platform. Her face was slightly pale. In a trembling voice she said, "Even if it is a broken fairyland, it is still a fairyland. Heaven and man walk different paths. One must have a heart of respect." The naive children of Tiani Dao worshipped the temple deeply in their bones. Among the disciples of Qing Mountain, no one had ever inherited Master Ku He's valiant spirit, including Haitang. When people faced the temple and entered it, they all unconsciously felt that they were much weaker. What is there to fear? Fan Xian did not say this out loud. He thought viciously in his heart. Uncle Wu Zhu had said that there were not many people left in the family. One had died in the alley outside the manor. When his mother died, one had also died in the temple. Seeing that he had entered this place safely and still no emissary from the temple had appeared, he could be sure that this run-down temple was just a wasteland. The temple was not a fairyland. It was just a ruin. After confirming this reality, Fan Xian no longer had any fear in his heart. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the green bird on the platform. Suddenly he said, "It looks like the emissary is dead. The immortals in the temple have long left, leaving only this fairy bird. Let's stroll around." Let's go back. Haitang and 13th Wang turned their heads to look at Fan Xian in disbelief. Their emotions were unsettled. They did not hear Fan Xian's lie. Of course, this was also because of the faint disappointment and sorrow that could not be wiped away on Fan Xian's pale face. His acting was too brilliant. Blind. Haitang was going to say that if the temple was truly so barren and broken down, if there was truly no supreme existence beyond the six directions, why didn't they try to find Wu Zhu's whereabouts and instead return without any success? 13th Wang's muscles were tense. He didn't know how to face this spacious and desolate temple. After experiencing so many hardships, they had finally passed through the snowy plains to reach this place. How could he be willing to return? Fan Xian coughed hurriedly and stopped Haitang's question. He only stared fixedly at the green bird on the platform. Everything in the world needed a reason. Since the temple was only the ruins of a civilization and a museum, then the voice in the temple had invited the three of them into the temple. Naturally, there was something he needed to do. Things developed as Fan Xian expected. The green bird on the snowy platform suddenly chirped a few times and flapped its wings toward the misty sky. It only flew about 100 feet high before it suddenly turned into countless spots of light and disappeared into the air. Haitang and 13th Wang's bodies trembled. Using their fastest speed, they moved closer to Fan Xian and protected his entire body. They were terrified that the change in the temple would cause Fan Xian, the weakest person, to die. Fan Xian was not afraid at all. He only narrowed his eyes and looked coldly at the slowly descending spots of light. The spots of light fell into the air above the platform and began to coalesce together like countless fireflies in the summer night sky. For some mysterious reason, they had arranged themselves into a certain shape. The spots of light gradually grew brighter and dimmer, revealing a gradually clearer figure in the air. The lines grew clearer. They could see clearly the flowing clouds at the corners of the sleeves, the black gold and jade belt at the waist, and the upturned shoes at the feet. An elder in a wide-sleeved ancient robe appeared in midair. It was impossible to see his features clearly, but it was possible to clearly see his existence. His feet were not standing on the platform. Instead, he was floating in the air. He was clearly there, but Haitang and 13th Wang could not feel a trace of his breathing or heartbeat. They didn't even feel his existence. Standing in the air, it was as if he wanted to go with the wind. His wide sleeves danced gently on the platform. A faint light enveloped the elder's entire body. Such a scene stunned the hearts of the three people in front of the platform. To be able to dance in the air and emit golden light, what level of cultivation was this? No, this was no cultivation. This was clearly a celestial technique. Other than the immortals in the temple, who else could appear in front of the people in such a way that made people want to kneel and worship? Haitang and 13th Wang opened their dazed eyes and looked at the scene in front of them that they could not understand no matter what. Naturally, they connected the existence formed by the green bird to the legendary immortals in the temple. Their bodies trembled uncontrollably. Naturally, they knelt down and sincerely knelt toward the snowy ground. Fan Xian also knelt down. His knees sank into the thin, soft snow. His body began to tremble like a mortal who had sunk into excitement and could not free himself. No one could explain the scene in front of them. Even the civilization of Fan Xian's previous life could not create such a miraculous phenomenon. The immortal standing in the air, glowing with a bright light, appeared very real. He was truly like a god. However, most of Fan Xian's excitement and fear were still faked. He forced himself to calm down. His mind spun quickly as he analyzed the immortal who had appeared in front of him. If this temple was a museum and, as the people in the temple said, a military museum, then how could there be immortals? Since it was not an immortal, then what was it? Fan Xian had lived 2 lives and had never squeezed out his brain cells like he did today. His head was slightly lowered as he thought furiously. Was it the holographic image he had heard of in his previous life? Fan Xian didn't throw a handful of snow over to see if it would pass through the immortal's body. Once he made up his mind, his fear naturally lessened a great deal. Like Haitang and 13th Wang, he knelt sincerely in front of the snowy platform. Northern Cheese Tiani Dao, Haitang, greets immortals. Haitang Duo thought that the immortal in the temple would certainly know of the Qing Mountain branch, the Tiani Dao school that worshipped the temple and spread the temple's benevolent ideals. Dongyi's Sword Hut, 13th Wang. 13th Wang's voice was a bit strange. This brave young man was probably finally confused by the mental blow. Qing Kingdom's Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not hide his true name. The last temple emissary had died at Uncle Wu Zhu's hands because of the emperor's ruthless methods. Presumably, the temple did not know of his connection to Yi Qingmei. He was only thinking about what the temple wanted to do by opening its doors wide to the three of them. If the temple had pretended to be immortals in this world's myths and legends for countless years, then presumably, they would continue acting today. To pretend to be immortals, they had to be extremely pretentious and put on airs. Only then would they be able to scare people like Haitang and 13th Wang. If they didn't speak first, the temple would probably not have any reaction. The three of us came from the south. Fan Xian recounted the hardships on the snowy plains in a raspy voice to prove their determination and their worship and yearning for the temple. Haitang and 13th Wang finally came to their senses and knew that Fan Xian was lying. They couldn't help but feel shocked. They thought that immortals could tell if they were loyal or not with a single thought. To lie in front of an immortal, Fan Xian was being too daring. You are the creatures of the world, the people the mighty temple looks upon with pity. The icy and snowy road proves your determination. If you have any doubts, you need the guidance of light, and the light is right in front of you. The immortal that the green bird had transformed into finally spoke. There was not a trace of emotion in his voice. Strangely, it was not icy cold. On the contrary, it had a sense of warmth and intimacy. The immortal's voice echoed through the empty and silent temple, buzzing. No one knew whether the voice came from the immortal's lips or from all directions in the world. The miraculous appearance of these words made Haitang and 13th Wang once again confirm their judgment that the other party was an immortal. However, Fan Xian smiled coldly in his heart. It was nothing more than an upgraded version of a loud cough. The light was right in front. Did they need guidance? The people of the world were miserable. If they had any doubts, they could ask the immortals in the temple for help. Thus, Fan Xian opened his mouth. Most noble immortal, we want to know who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. They had come from the south and had already reached the temple. Who knew where they were going? The green bird led them to the stone platform but was unable to tell them this philosophical awkward-sounding question. After the immortal heard Fan Xian's 3 questions, he immediately fell silent. His clothes fluttering in the cold air immediately became stiff and did not tremble at all. Haitang and 13th Wang did not understand why Fan Xian would ask these 3 questions. Fan Xian had already slowly stood up. His eyes were unusually calm and cold as he looked at the immortal who had sunk into silence. Through careful observation, he finally confirmed his judgment. You are you. You came from where you came from, and you are going to where you are going. The immortal's clothes fluttered. His voice was still warm, and his reply was mysterious. This reply fell into Haitang's and 13th Wang's ears. If it fell into anyone's ears, it would seem particularly beautiful. However, this was the reply Fan Xian wanted. He looked calmly at the glowing figure floating in the air and thought to himself that it had taken such a long time to search through the database. It looked like the temple's energy was about to run out. It was clear that the immortal was not angry at Fan Xian for standing up straight and looking at him rudely. Amidst the light, he gazed warmly at Fan Xian. That is not the answer I want, Fan Xian said. An answer is just an answer. Whether or not you need it is actually just a question of your heart. The immortal's reply was still full of the air of a quack. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, I want to know the temple's past. The immortal once again fell silent. The light enveloping his clothes immediately dimmed. Fan Xian stared unblinkingly at the patch of light and silently begged in his heart. If you are truly a holographic image, if you are truly just a guide for this museum, complete your mission and narrate this already lost history. If someone could actually enter the legendary temple, perhaps they would want the golden touch, the art of immortality, or those incomparably miraculous martial secrets. Fan Xian was different. What he wanted to know the most was the history of the temple. Outside the door of the temple, he had once blurted out the words, museum. It was clear that the person in the temple had not guessed because of those 3 people that there was a soul faintly connected to him in Fan Xian's body. The immortal's clothes froze for a long time. The light dimmed a great deal. Perhaps the thoughts of the people dancing in the spots of light were weighing some kind of permission to enter. Chapter 751. I'm tired, I'm sick, I'm rushing around everywhere, I basically don't drink, and in the end, I'm also exhausted. Oh, I'm really a useless person. The cows are always losing, crying sadly, just like how they sighed during the lawnette last time. There's nothing perfect in this world to begin with. On the 10th day of the new year, the update resumed, and then with a spurt of energy. Chapter 752. Why did the temple appear? Why did it appear? Its past, present, and future were the target of Fan Xian's question. After Fan Xian's question rang out in the snow-covered temple, the fairy that the green bird had transformed into sank into silence. Haitang and 13th Wang also sensed the change in Fan Xian's emotions. Forcefully suppressing the nervousness in their hearts, they raised their heads. In such a wondrous temple of ice and snow, only Fan Xian could maintain his calm. Even those as powerful as Haitang and 13th Wang had become naked babies. Under the gaze of the fairy on the snowy platform, they could not feel a trace of disrespect. The fairy was silent for a long time. He then said to Fan Xian standing at his feet, "This is not something that mortals should attempt to come into contact with or understand. I've never thought of myself as a mortal." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the specks of light in the air. Lowering his voice, he said, "Similarly, I also don't think of you as an immortal." The temple could faintly influence the thousands of years of history of this land. Additionally, there was a law that the temple could not interfere in worldly affairs. Fan Xian knew that in order to maintain his lofty and mysterious position, regardless of whether the temple was a relic or some strange object beside it, it would certainly follow the stories and the legends of the people and disguise itself as an illusory existence. "Since you don't want to tell us, then please tell us, why did you invite us into the temple?" Fan Xian's eyes stared directly at the strange sight and person formed by the specks of light in the air. Calmly, he said, "No mortal has ever been able to enter the temple. You let us in, presumably, you have a request for us." Haitang and 13th Wang had already heard something strange in the conversation between Fan Xian and the fairy. Slowly, they rose from the snowy ground. They found that Fan Xian was still able to converse so calmly in front of a supreme existence beyond the scope of common people's understanding. They truly admired him greatly. However, Haitang Duo and 13th Wang still did not understand. Was Fan Xian really going to discuss some sort of deal with the fairy in the temple? Why was he not in a hurry to find the whereabouts of the blind master? Haitang stood gently behind Fan Xian and followed his gaze to the sky. It was just this glance, but it had already used up all the courage in her body. It was also this glance that suddenly moved her heart. Fan Xian was standing in front of the fairy. Why couldn't she? "I've had many professions in the secular world, but I'm still best at business." Fan Xian said, "That is why I am a merchant who only cares about profit. I don't like to reap without sowing. I also don't want to do things that harm my own interests just to be shrouded in the light of the temple. Whatever you want us to do for the temple, you must pay a price." From the moment he entered the temple until now, Fan Xian's entire state of mind had become unusually clear and calm. Yes, he still did not have a definite understanding of the temple, but he had to force himself to calm down and not think of the other person as a god. He could only think of the other person as a real existence. Furthermore, he faintly guessed that this trip to the temple had gone so smoothly because the person in the temple had some request of the three of them. He even had a general idea of that request. The path of the gods is dim, the path of the great path is not prosperous. Wandering on the wrong path, pointing to the mountains and rivers, angry at the wind and clouds, bringing peace to the country, therefore. The human figure formed by the spots of light on the snowy platform paused for a moment and then suddenly opened its mouth to read a long and ancient essay. The central meaning was actually very simple. The fairy in the temple hoped that Fan Xian, Haitang, and 13th Wang could become the emissaries of the temple and secretly observe the world on behalf of the temple. They also wanted to choose an appropriate time to return to the temple and report to the people in the temple. Haitang and 13th Wang sank into deep thought. Complicated emotions rose in their eyes. They had probably never thought that once they entered the temple, the immortals in the temple would not turn them into stone. Instead, they would give them such an important yet nonsensical mission. Observe the affairs of the world on behalf of the temple? In the future, if the three of them left the temple, they would probably never return. The people in the temple could not leave the temple to interfere in worldly affairs, so how could they control them? This was a very simple request. In the eyes of the disciples of Tianyi Dao, This was perhaps a supreme and particularly noble mission. However, in Fan Xian's eyes, this was just another confirmation of his guess. Could it be? This is the legendary Tianmai being? Crabapple Dwudwa's heart trembled slightly as she thought of a term. In the legends, Tianmai individuals were known as the bloodline of the heavens. They would awaken once every several hundred years. Tianmai individuals could represent undefeatable battle prowess, or they could represent great talent and intelligence. These legendary figures would all disappear without a trace in the end. After Haitang Duo left Qing Mountain, she was also promoted by the Northern Qi court as this generation's Tianmai being. She was known as a genius. However, she knew that she was not one of those legendary figures. In comparison, Fan Xian, who could remain so calm in the face of an immortal and could spit out 300 poems in one night, was more like a Tianmai being. Not a Tianmai being. This kind of identity is only that of an emissary of the temple. Fan Xian suddenly broke the silence and opened his mouth to explain to the two friends beside him. This temple has already been abandoned. Other than this immortal, there are no other emissaries that can observe the movements of the world. More accurately speaking, those emissaries have all died in the human world. If the temple does not want to be forgotten by the world and not want to forget this world, it must find an emissary again. Coincidentally, the three of us came to the temple and gave this immortal a chance. Of course, for him, this was not much of a gamble, because he believed that the experts of the world would be very willing to investigate the world on behalf of the high and mighty temple. Even your teacher could not forget about the temple before he died, much less the other people. Fan Xian glanced at 13th Wang and lowered his head slightly. If you want to be, then be. Presumably, this is the first time the temple has chosen outsiders to be emissaries. They don't have any rules or regulations. Strangely, Fan Xian said these words in front of the immortal on the snowy platform. It was as if he was not worried at all about angering the immortal. Indeed, this was the case. There was not a trace of change in emotion on the immortal's old face formed purely from light. He only waited coldly and woodenly for the three people below the platform to reply. The emissaries of the temple have all died. Of course, there were not many emissaries in the temple to begin with. That is why you thought of using the three of us as your eyes. However, the problem is that you cannot control our actions after we leave the temple. You are only making the only possible choice in a situation where you have no other choice. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at the patch of light. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly. However, I still want to gain some benefits. According to my analysis, the so-called Tianmai being is nothing more than, in the long river of history, you, through the emissaries walking the world, imparted knowledge that was not equal to that era to those people. In other words, Master Ku he is a Tianmai being. My emperor is also a Tianmai being. Everyone says that Tianmai beings only appear once every few hundred years, but it is clear that in recent decades, this land has been a bit too lively. The immortal's face did not tremble at all. He only bent his body slightly and looked down at Fan Xian, who was speaking calmly. A moment later he said, "Those were unexpected circumstances. He is not a Tianmai being." Fan Xian nodded and did not refute these words. Regardless of whether it was the martial method that Master Ku he cultivated or the tyrannical Xueqi that the emperor practiced, they were all things that his mother, Yi Qingmei, had stolen from this run-down temple. There was no legitimacy to the inheritance, so the old man in the temple would not admit it. "Child, you know a lot of things." The immortal on the snowy platform watched Fan Xian warmly. "Don't call me child. I don't like being called that. As for the things I know, I do indeed know a lot. After all, I have my own thoughts. I am not like the emissaries you have sent into the world over the countless years, who have no emotions and thoughts of their own." Fan Xian did not shrink back and looked back into the immortal's deep eyes. Calmly he said, "I even know that the large article you wrote earlier was actually all plagiarized phrases. From this, it can be seen that you can only do some simple gathering and writing work. You are unable to have your own creative abilities." Ever since he had stood up from the snowy ground, Fan Xian had been calm, even coldly speaking to this figure in the temple as an equal. It was as if he was not worried that this mysterious temple would easily kill him. However, this calmness was actually only a pretense. These emotions were based on his analysis of the temple and the knowledge of two lives. "It is Qiu Wu Zhou. It looks like you have truly surprised me and made me think of some things. However, if you are willing to become emissaries of the temple, I will not mind the rudeness of your words, the immortal said coldly. The immortal said coldly, the godly temple has never traded with mortals. Please remember this. Since you have remembered some things from the past, you know that not everyone in this world will be scared by you and then listen to whatever you say, the immortal said coldly. You are just a lonely old man. The people under your command have all died one by one. Other than us, who else in the world do you think can find this broken temple? Regardless of whether you let us leave or kill us, you can only be forever trapped in this snowy mountain and never know what exactly has happened in the world you calmly observe. Even if you can make an exception and make a deal, in reality, you have already received the temple's selfless gift. You know that as the children of the temple, you should contribute your strength to the sustainable development of the entire world. I don't know what the temple has bestowed on me. The immortal's gaze swept across the three people in front of the snowy platform. I chose you to enter the temple and gave this great mission to you because you all have the aura of the temple on you, particularly you. The immortal's gaze finally landed on Fan Xian's body. For Master Xueqi to be able to become a great grandmaster, he had relied on the martial method that Yi Qingmei had stolen from the temple. Dongyi's unparalleled sword skills more or less carried some of the style of the emissaries of the temple. The one with the thickest aura was, of course, Fan Xian. He had lived with Uncle Wu Zhu since he was young. He was Yi Qingmei's son. The major martial methods that the temple had left in the world were all in his body. This immortal, who had guarded the temple for tens of thousands of years, could easily see this. You mean that you cannot give the three of us any more benefits? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. Since it is so, we cannot enter the temple and return empty-handed. If you don't give, we can only search ourselves. As his words fell, the immortal in the light smiled slightly. It was as if he felt a glimmer of absurdity that an ant-like mortal dared to forcefully steal treasures from the temple under the gaze of a god. After Fan Xian finished speaking, he stopped talking to the dots of light. Instead, he circled around the stone platform and walked toward the most well-preserved building in the temple under the thin layer of snow. Haitang and 13th Wang jumped in fright. They didn't know if such an impolite action would anger the immortal in the temple. Would lightning descend in a moment and turn Fan Xian to dust? The face of the immortal formed by the dots of light on the snowy platform froze slightly. It was as if he had not expected Fan Xian's actions in all of his calculations. Immediately after, the immortal's body immediately disintegrated. In an instant, it appeared in front of Fan Xian's path and blocked the door to the well-preserved building. Disappearing and reappearing at such speed was indeed not something that could appear in the mortal world. However, Haitang Duo and 13th Wang forcefully suppressed the shock in their hearts. Turning into two streaks of smoke, they swept over in an attempt to protect Fan Xian's life under the immortal's furious attack. However, nothing happened. Fan Xian's footsteps did not pause at all. He walked straight into the human figure formed by the dots of light. The dots of light were not scattered by his body or flew off in all directions. They did not become countless bolts of lightning and explode him to pieces. Instead, they suddenly swelled and seemed to stick to Fan Xian's snowy robe. Just like this, under Haitang and 13th Wang's shocked gazes, Fan Xian walked straight into the immortal's light. He then walked out and approached the building's main door. A light breeze blew past. The immortal's light flared once again and suddenly appeared in front of the building's main door, blocking in front of Fan Xian. However, a wooden expression appeared in that pair of unfathomable, heaven-like eyes. Fan Xian calmly looked into the eyes of the immortal floating in the air. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, "I see through you." Chapter 753. In the extremely cold snowy mountains of the north and the extremely cold misty temple, Fan Xian walked toward the building without turning his head. Once again, he broke through the body of the immortal. In this snow-covered world, countless dazzling spots of light appeared. No one noticed that under his snowy jacket, his back was already drenched. In such a cold climate, sweat seeped out of his body and soaked all of his undergarments. His expression remained calm. No one knew how much courage and determination he had gathered in that instant when he charged into the immortal's body. Fan Xian did not know what kind of unfathomable power the temple possessed. Was it as the emperor and Uncle Wu Zhu said and had already fallen to a certain degree? However, it was clear that Uncle Wu Zhu had been lost in the temple. This made him feel a natural fear of the temple. However, he still wanted to gamble. Looking at it now, it seemed that he had won the gamble. The immortal's body formed by the spots of light clearly did not have any great power. It was closer to the hologram Fan Xian had guessed earlier. However, there were still many secrets in the temple and many things that could not be explained clearly, such as the dense Xueqi in the surroundings and the secret martial arts manuals his mother had once stolen. In that world, perhaps there was the Chen Taiji manual, but it was certainly not as wondrous as the tyrannical martial secrets. Fan Xian's thin lips trembled slightly as he stepped over the threshold of the undamaged building. His hands were behind his back as he made a gesture to Haitang and 13th Wang. He hoped that these two companions would be able to stand strong under the might of the temple and help him. He charged into the building. The spots of light followed him in like fireflies, leaving behind an empty patch of snowy ground and the snowy platform without the footprints of a green bird. The two heavy doors closed silently, shutting Fan Xian inside but shutting Haitang and 13th Wang outside. Haitang and 13th Wang had not yet shaken off their shock. They didn't know where Fan Xian found the courage to pass through the immortal's body. They also didn't understand why the immortal had been pushed into a patch of spots of light by Fan Xian. They were more worried about Fan Xian's safety behind the tightly shut door. Haitang Duodwa's eyes narrowed slightly. Light flared in her eyes. Just as she was about to raise all her cultivation and force her way through, 13th Wang suddenly opened his mouth and said, "His hand signal is for us to stay outside and use this opportunity to find someone." Fan Xian had taken such a great risk and left Haitang and 13th Wang outside the door in the hopes that they could use the opportunity he had fought for with his life to search for traces of Uncle Wu Zhu in the temple. Fan Xian had traveled thousands of li and tirelessly come to the temple because of his closest uncle. This was a building that looked like an ancient temple, but the building material inside was not ordinary bluestone, but a material similar to metal. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. He quickly scanned the inside of the hall. He found that the building was empty. There was nothing out of the ordinary. There were only patches of empty space. Based on the name of the museum, one could faintly think that countless years ago, this place was perhaps an exhibition stand. The murals on the outside of the temple had long fallen. However, the murals in this building were still well preserved. One could clearly see the scenes painted on them. Fan Xian placed his hands behind his back and bent his body like an old man. He carefully walked in front of these murals. His gaze swept across them meticulously and carefully. Since the immortal formed by the light spots was not willing to tell him the truth of history, then he could only find the truth himself. As Fan Xian bent his body and looked intently at the murals, the immortal formed by the light spots floated behind him like a ghost. Fan Xian knew this, but he didn't turn his head to look. He also didn't open his mouth to ask anything. The scene was very strange. Being followed by an immortal or a ghost, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a bit scared. However, he appeared unusually calm. The style of these murals was very similar to the oil paintings Fan Xian knew from his previous life. The contents depicted were all ancient myths that were occasionally mentioned in the classics of the land. However, the faces of the gods were very blurry. Regardless of whether they were thundering on the summit of a mountain, floating in the sea, or bathing in the magma of a volcano, there was always a strange white fog that covered their true faces. Fan Xian's heart thumped. He once again thought of the murals in the Qing Temple in Jingdou and the murals in the Qing Temple on Dong Mountain. The contents depicted on these murals were events from thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. They must have been passed down through countless generations, so it was inevitable that they were blurry. However, this temple was the source of all legends. Why were the faces of the gods on these murals still blurry? The immortal in the temple, who had been following Fan Xian's footsteps like a wisp of light, suddenly said, "These murals were created by Bor." Bor? 300 years ago, the great magician in the West. I heard that he and his wife, Fu Bo, were both Tianmai beings. In the end, they disappeared without a trace. So in the end they returned to the temple, Fan Xian said with furrowed brows. Tianmai beings are chosen by the temple to spread the seeds of wisdom into the world. I had thought that these Tianmai beings in the end would have strange thoughts in their hearts and be killed by the emissaries the temple sent out. Unexpectedly, there were still some who returned to the temple alive. The temple forbids interfering in the affairs of the world. Naturally, they would not kill people. However, you are right. After countless years, There will always be Tianmai beings who inherited the temple's teachings. They will have wild thoughts in their hearts and cause suffering for the common people. Whenever this happens, the temple will send out emissaries and have them disappear without a trace. This is probably the reason why the legendary Tianmai beings all disappeared without a trace in the end. Fan Xian noticed that the wisp of light behind him still had a calm and warm tone. However, when he referred to him, he used "sir" and began to communicate with him. But Bo and Fubo, the couple, were a different matter. They did not have any worldly desires. After Fubo died, Bo experienced endless hardship and returned to the temple. Coincidentally, the murals in the temple were almost broken, so he spent 7 years to repair the murals in the temple. But the history of the Qing Temple in Dong Mountain and the Jingdo Qing Temple is more than 300 years. How could those murals still be Bo's style? Because Bo only repaired and did not create. He followed the style of the murals from many years ago. Naturally, it is similar to the murals in the world you grew up in. Fan Xian suddenly pointed at the sky full of flames and light in the murals. Narrowing his eyes, he asked, "Why don't those gods have faces?" "Because true gods never show their faces to others." "So, you are not a true god." The spots of light floating in the air behind Fan Xian gradually shed the old man's face and transformed into a mirror-like existence. After a long silence it said, "Just as you said earlier, I am not a god." "Very good. I was just worried that you had gone crazy after being cooped up in this snowy mountain for tens of thousands of years and truly thought of yourself as a god. Then, this matter would not be easy to deal with." Hearing the voice of the temple itself coming from all around him, Fan Xian's mood relaxed slightly. At least, the craziest and most terrifying possibility had been denied by the temple itself. If it was an existence that truly had life and emotions, hearing Fan Xian's words, it would certainly understand the meaning hidden within. However, it was clear that the existence in the temple was only passively thinking according to some established process and did not continue to say anything. It's not that gods don't have faces. There are no gods. For some reason, after Fan Xian said these words, his mood suddenly became desolate. If there truly were no gods in the world, then his existence and his mother's existence would remain unfathomable and without reason. Those are just some powerful machines or weapons. Fan Xian pointed at the gods on the murals that could split open the earth and said quietly, "I don't know what kind of weapons they are. Atomic bombs or neutron bombs. In any case, they are all very terrifying things." After the thread of light floating in the air heard Fan Xian's words, the mirror-like surface suddenly gave off a powerful ripple. It was as if it was undergoing intense thinking. Perhaps it was because Fan Xian had said something it had never imagined it would hear that made it unable to analyze it clearly in a short time. The light in the building was not very dazzling. It was faint and gently sprinkled on Fan Xian's body like it was giving him a layer of holy light. Perhaps it was because of the need to preserve the exhibits or because the temple's energy was about to run out, but the light was not very bright. Fan Xian walked forward silently until he had seen all of the murals. Only then did he return to the center of the building. Turning his head back to look at the thread of light floating in the air, he was silent for a long time. He then said, "By now, you should know that I am not a normal person. My 2 companions are not here at this time, so I think you don't have to be afraid of anything. You can tell me about the temple's origins." The mirror-like surface formed by the light sank into a deathly stillness. It seemed to be analyzing whether or not Fan Xian's request could be approved. Throwing a brick to attract jade. "Let me throw a brick first." Fan Xian coughed and felt a wave of weakness. Slowly, he sat down on the icy ground. As he slowly absorbed the yuan-qi that was everywhere between heaven and earth, he slowly said in a raspy voice, "The temple is a historical site, the remains of some civilization. Using your words, this is a military museum. Thus, it keeps the top and most terrifying existences of that civilization. You won't tell me the history of the temple, so I can only guess based on these murals and some of my knowledge. That civilization is certainly one I am familiar with." Fan Xian slowly closed his eyes and thought of what Shaoan had said in the cave, as well as what Uncle Wu Zhu had once said. Not long after his mother escaped the temple the first time, she should have returned to the temple to find Uncle Wu Zhu. Since that was the case, that chest should have been stolen from the temple by his mother the second time. There was a barret in the military museum, so it was clear that this museum had existed much later than when Fan Xian had left. Furthermore, it was a civilization of the same origin. Fan Xian did not believe that some ancient civilization could make a gun that was exactly the same as the one he had made. He thought of the familiar civilization of the same origin as the world he had once lived in. It had already become a shadow in history, a broken temple in the snowy mountains that people could not touch. The people Fan Xian. No, the people Fan Xian had once loved, hated, and pitied had long become wisps of ghosts in the long river of time. The things he had once wondered, seen, and admired had all become yellow sand. A glimmer of pain grew in his heart. The pain was not very strong, but it was particularly clear. It was sour and particularly frustrated. He had never seen anyone before or after. Other than Yi Qingmei, there was only him. The world was long. How could he endure it? Such tens of thousands of years of loneliness had fallen on his body alone. How heavy was it? Fan Xian sat on the ground and coughed repeatedly. His breathing was hurried. After a long time, an indifferent and dim light rose in his eyes. His expression was not a smile. Looking at the mirror in the air formed from light spots, he asked, "As someone who once traveled with you, can you tell me exactly how that world was destroyed? Did a madman really start to throw nuclear bombs around for fun?" The mirror of light was as smooth as ice. After a long time, the warm and steady voice rang out in all directions inside the building. It was a great battle in the divine realm. The immortals all used shocking treasures and raised shocking waves. The ground changed shape and volcanoes erupted. Enough! Fan Xian's angry voice rang out in the empty building. He stared fixedly at the mirror and coughed violently. In the end, he coughed up a trickle of blood. He stubbornly wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and cursed at the mirror. "I am that stupid person from the divine realm. Don't talk about this shit. Your King Broken Museum, not some King Temple." Inside the Qing royal palace, full of spring, a clear and icy voice slowly rang out in the royal study. The wooden door to the royal study was slightly open to make it easier for air to enter. Eunuch Yao and the other eunuchs and serving girls waited carefully outside the room and did not enter. Living high in the temple, one worries about the people. Living far from the Jianghu, one worries about the ruler. There is worry about advancing and worry about retreating. But when should one be happy? It must be said, first worry about the worries of the world, then enjoy the joys of the world. Fan Ruoruo quietly finished reading the article and closed the page. She then walked to a corner of the royal study and began to stare blankly. She looked at the flourishing spring trees outside the window and couldn't help but think of her brother. She heard that they had gone north. What was there in the north? Was the legendary temple in the north? She heard that the extreme north was covered in ice and snow all year round. It was not a place normal people could get close to. Was her brother well? It was already the end of spring. 4 months had passed since the last change in the palace. The entire royal palace was enveloped in a warm and beautiful sunlight. However, the royal study maintained an icy coldness. The Qing emperor lay on a soft couch with a thin blanket covering his body. His face was pale, and his eyes were lifeless. Following Fan Ruoro's gaze, he looked at the green trees outside the window. For some reason, the emperor particularly loathed the existence of these green trees. Perhaps it was because he felt that the passing of spring and the arrival of autumn and the replacement of all things was an irresistible rule of nature. Worry about the ruler, worry about the people. Back then, Anji spoke up in the northern Qi royal palace. In the end, he was forced by the little emperor to write a paragraph. In the end, he only wrote this paragraph without a head or tail, the emperor slowly said. The emperor opened his mouth and slowly said, "I just don't understand. How could a boy who could write such words do such a disrespectful thing?" After so much time had passed, the Qing court knew that the traitor Fan Xian had long escaped Jingdo. The intelligence reports sent back from the north accurately pointed to Fan Xian's whereabouts. What surprised many Qing officials was that after Fan Xian escaped Jingdo, he did not throw himself into the arms of the northern Qi court. Even more surprising was that the emperor seemed to only focus his anger on Fan Xian and did not begin a purge within the Qing kingdom. The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. His sparse eyelashes were like an ominous broken autumn leaf as they drooped on his increasingly wrinkled face. His gaze flitted across Fan Ruoro's shoulder. Suddenly he asked, "Am I really not a good emperor?" This was a lamentable and absurd question. How the Qing emperor did on the throne was a question that needed to be acknowledged by history. However, for some reason, this most powerful man in the world especially needed to obtain the approval of certain people. At the beginning, he had wanted to put Fan Xian under house arrest in Jingdo because he wanted to use Fan Xian's eyes to tell those people who had died. Now, Fan Xian had rebelled. He was used to asking Fan Ruoruo this question. It was clear that he had asked this question more than once. Fan Ruoruo didn't even turn her head. She calmly replied, "This is not a question I should answer." Suddenly, Eunuch Yao's voice rang out from outside the royal study. "Imperial Consort Yi has arrived. Princess Chen has arrived." Before he had finished speaking, Imperial Consort Yi and Lin Wan'er walked in. It was clear that these two women had come many times during this period of time. The emperor only glanced at them coldly and did not open his mouth to scold them. He didn't tell them to get out. He allowed them to come to the side of the soft couch and help his body up. Lin Wan'er changed all of the blankets on the soft couch. As she wiped the fine sweat from her forehead, she smiled and said, "It's all new cotton from Zhongzhou. The embroidery is all the most fashionable in Quanzhou. Try it and see if it's comfortable." Imperial Consort Yi took out a few ingredients from the food box and carefully fed the emperor. As she fed, she nagged, "The sun has been good these 2 days. Your Majesty should go out and walk around." The emperor coldly said, "Don't you find it annoying to come every day? It's not like I can't move." The emperor's injury had indeed not healed. Contrary to the expectations of Fan Ruoruo and the Imperial Academy of Medicine, it was strangely lingering. Perhaps it was because he was old. If he had been at the peak of the Qing emperor's power, no matter how serious his injury, he would probably have long recovered. It was as if Lin Wan'er didn't hear her uncle's words. With a sweet smile, she began to massage his shoulders. Fan Ruoruo watched for a while and couldn't resist shaking her head. She sat on the other side of the emperor and began to massage him. The royal study sank into silence. Imperial Consort Yi sat quietly in front of the emperor and watched this scene with a slight smile. There was no purge in the court. The officials of the He faction had been slaughtered by Fan Xian. On the contrary, it had turned the court into an iron bucket. The third prince, Li Changping, had recently, under who the scholars lead, begun to try to come into contact with political affairs. Although Consort May's belly was very big, no matter how one looked at it, the Qing kingdom was in a strange state of stability. At least, in the eyes of the people, the emperor had no intention of changing the heir. Nothing seemed to have changed in the Qing kingdom. On the contrary, it seemed to have become better, except for the young man called Fan Xian. He had disappeared from the world for almost half a year. No one knew where he was or if he was still alive. Lin Wan'er did not return to Danzhou with her entire family as Fan Xian had planned. Instead, she calmly stayed in Jingdo. Furthermore, she entered the palace more often than before. This scene shocked countless people. "Tomorrow, I will go to court. Don't come." After a long silence, the emperor suddenly spoke. His tone was cold, but there was a thread of heaviness that was difficult to detect. Perhaps it was such a man who actually enjoyed the service of his family these days. However, these family members were, after all, the family of the son who dared to oppose him. "Yes, Your Majesty." Lin Wan'er smiled warmly and didn't say anything more. She knew exactly what she was doing. She also knew that she was only inheriting Fan Xian's thoughts. "Don't hope for that kid to come back alive. If he does come back, even if I can spare his life, the officials of the world will not allow him to live." The emperor slowly closed his eyes. The corners of his lips drooped like his eyelashes. He appeared tired. Could Fan Xian come back alive? This was a question that weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. The emperor's words clearly cut off everyone's path of retreat. The emperor continued to close his eyes tightly and coldly said, "You all don't know why he had to find the temple, but I know that he wanted Lao Wu to come back and kill me. For such a heartless son, should I have any pity for him?" Now that the situation had developed to this point, the Qing emperor had already shown rare magnanimity by not beating all the people related to Fan Xian into dust. Of course, it was mostly because of the agreement between him and Fan Xian. After all, he didn't know if Fan Xian was dead or not. Although it seemed that since ancient times, no one had ever been able to find the temple on their own, much less rescue someone from the temple, the emperor still could not relax. He knew that a woman had once done it. Would his son with that woman bring another great surprise to the world? If Lao Wu truly came back with Fan Xian, what would happen to him? What would happen to the world? The emperor suddenly opened his eyes. A cold light shone through them. Summon Yi Zhong into the palace. Chapter 754. The dark gray land was burning, the dark blue sea was burning, and the boundless sky was burning. Everything in the world seemed to be enveloped by the blazing flames, trying its best to squeeze out every bit of fuel in its body, adding it to the raging flames. The volcano erupted, and the boiling red magma submerged into the seawater, evaporating endless fog. It also drove the ocean currents to set off huge waves that were each taller than the last, constantly slamming against the land that had long been melted into a strange shape. The world was filled with terrifying light and heat, filled with the smell of destruction. The animals on the land screamed miserably, their fur rotten, and their bones could be seen. It was as if the light, the waves, and the flames were soul-devouring flames from the netherworld that they could never escape. No matter how far they escaped from the burning forest, no matter how deep they dug into the deep holes under the grassland, they still could not escape the destruction that could destroy all living beings. The animals in the sea were also swimming uneasily, desperately avoiding the heat and poisonous gases that surged out from the deep trenches at the bottom of the sea. The mammals that were used to swimming freely in the cold sea poked their heads out of the water in extreme despair, but what entered their lungs was boiling air and the dust that carried fatal toxins. The birds in the sky were still flying with all their might, far away from the dazzling light in the sky, desperately flying towards the two ends of the land. The natural sensitivity of life made them know that they could probably only find the final paradise in those places where people rarely went. This was a great migration that was completely out of sync with the season, and in this migration, most of the birds still died on the way, landing on the withered land. There were very few birds that could truly hide from the blazing light and the black dust. The light in the world gradually dimmed, but the air was filled with dust and dark clouds, mercilessly blocking the round sun above their heads. The entire green grassland had long changed color. The animals that had survived the calamity gathered around a small pool, desperately fighting for the only clean water source. More than 30 large crocodiles hid in the depths of the pool, and countless animals around the pool gathered and began to dig small puddles. Some bold and strong carnivores bravely began to attack the crocodiles' territory. There were no longer any traces of birds in the sky, and the fish at the bottom of the sea had long been frightened into the coral reefs in the deep sea, not daring to come out. The sharks swimming around opened their large eyes in confusion, not knowing what had happened to this world and what had happened to their home. And on the surface of the sea, more than 10 huge sperm whales floated tiredly, occasionally flicking their tails weakly. Further away on the edge of the small island, the sea lions roared at the sky in despair and anger, mercilessly biting each other to vent the fear in the depths of their hearts. The animals gathered around the pool gradually died. Some died from killing each other, some died from inhaling the black dust in the air, some died from hunger, some died from thirst, and most of the animals actually died from drinking the water in the pool. The air was dry, and there were only countless pale bones left around the pool. Some were large, some were small, some were curled up, and some were crouching in fear. Their fur and flesh had long returned to the earth, leaving only these white bones in the surroundings, accompanying the most powerful reptiles in the pool, the reptiles that had not perished after tens of millions of years. After a few more days, the pool dried up. The large crocodiles that weighed hundreds of kilograms lay on the soil as if resigned to their fate, allowing the red mud on their backs to be burned by the not-so-blazing sun. They gradually died, gradually withered, gradually rotted, and gradually turned into shocking white bones. In reality, these powerful reptiles were actually dried up in the end. The sky was still deathly silent. Other than the thick black clouds that rolled and pressed down on the ground, there were no signs of life. The scene on the surface of the sea was even more cruel. Where the warm ocean currents met the cold currents in the northern part of the bay, countless large aquatic mammals either floated in the seawater by the island or sank to the quiet bottom of the sea. The whales, sea lions and manatees had long become rotten flesh, polluting the entire seawater and turning the entire bay into a field of carnage. The air was filled with a foul stench. The scavenging animals struggled at death's door for a longer time because of these huge existences. They acutely sensed that the closer they were to the shore of the land, the more the world was filled with the aura of death, so they were very careful when eating. Finally, one day, the dry, gloomy, hell-like world finally reigned. The rainwater struck the few remaining leaves at the edge of the grassland, waking up the insects hiding in their holes. Round water droplets rolled on the muddy ground, and a beetle happily washed its face. The rainwater gradually gathered and followed the ancient waterway, heading deep into the grassland. Along the way, it woke up countless creatures that used sleep to avoid destruction. The trickling river flowed into the pool surrounded by white bones. What was surprising was that a lizard hiding deep in the cracks of the rocks in the river was still alive. It stuck out its red tongue and clumsily stepped across the shallow water, licking the white bones in the crocodile's huge eye sockets. Occasionally, it would extend its right front leg and announce to the surroundings that it owned the pool. In any case, there were more than 1,000 white skeletons around the pool, and they had all sunk into silence. It was impossible for them to express any objections to its announcement. If those lions and baboons were still alive, the world would be different. No matter which world it was in, rain always represented life. This time seemed to be no exception. The black dust that filled the air was washed away by the rain. The dust that could not be blown away by the wind finally yielded to the power of the water god. A fresh and pleasant smell appeared in the air again. The creatures in the wilderness were born because of the water, gathered because of the water, and began a happy new life after the disaster. They began to hunt and kill each other again. Even though it was a bloody hunt, it still carried a happy smell of life. However, these creatures did not know that the black dust carried by the rain that fell from the sky was terrifying. They also did not know that the rain could wash away the dust, but it could never wash away the invisible lines that filled the world but were enough to kill most life. When it rained, the sea was much calmer. The waves slowly pushed the corpses of the dead animals to the rocks on the shore, and the rotten smell was washed away by the rain. However, the rain became heavier and heavier as if it would never stop. The animals that drank the rain began to feel that their lives were slowly leaving their bodies. They did not know why, but the instinctive fear made them feel despair. In the pouring rain, they used the last of their strength and began to carry out a cruel and ruthless killing. They did not even spare their own compatriots. After countless floods, big and small, life on land was once again dealt a heavy blow. Other than leaving countless corpses soaked in the muddy water, there was no longer any trace of life. The rotten corpses that piled up at the edge of the sea were beaten into disgusting bubbles by the rain. It had nothing to do with the fairy tale at all. However, heaven's punishment for this world did not seem to be over. After the rain came a sudden frost. From north to south, the air suddenly dropped by more than 10 degrees. The sun could not be seen in the world, and the seasons seemed to be in chaos. The deep cold of winter appeared in front of life that was already in danger. After the frost came the endless snow. At first, the snowflakes were still black and gray, but in the end, they returned to pure white, looking incomparably pure. They covered the sky, the earth, and the sea. The whole world was shrouded in wind and snow. The bitter cold descended on the earth, and the ice extended into the sea. The vast expanse of white was really clean. Endless snow fell endlessly. There was no longer any sign of life on the snowy ground. This scene continued calmly and coldly. 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years. It was a long time before he pulled his gaze away from the light mirror in the air. His eyes were bloodshot, and his lips were slightly white. Although everything shown in the scene earlier was the result of his analysis and judgment after entering the temple, truly seeing it happen in front of his eyes, the powerful sorrow and pain still made his heart ache even more. He knew that this was not the divine realm. He could not be like the people of this world and treat these as myths and then record them on murals and legends. He knew that all of this had truly happened. The lives that had died in the calamity had once truly existed. The bloodshot in his eyes represented exhaustion and mental and physical exhaustion. Fan Xian lowered his head and rubbed his eyes. He then raised his head again and gazed at the snowy scene in the mirror in the air that seemed to not change for tens of thousands of years. He knew that change would certainly happen. Otherwise, how could civilization have continued to the present world? What made his heart tremble was that even now, he still did not see what kind of terrifying torment the people in that world, his former companions, had suffered. Grand, wonderful, exquisite, simple. Buildings were completely different from grass nests and caves in this world. They were also the existences that had suffered the heaviest blow in the calamity. The people of that world had grasped some of the Creator's secrets. In the end, they had thrown these weapons of mass destruction onto their heads. This was an absurd reality. The high temperature melted cement and steel. The shock wave shattered everything that remained. Invisible and nameless rays of light killed everyone. After the drought came the flood. After the frost came the wind and snow. Countless years passed. Under the cover of the boundless white snow, the glory it once had been covered up. No one knew that there had once been a race that had once been incomparably glorious in this world. After an unknown number of years of wind and snow, someone finally appeared in the scene once again. The destruction of civilization, the survival instinct of life, and the brutal killing appeared once again. In the wasteland, the only thing that could survive was to successfully display the side of animal nature that was most difficult for human nature to accept in order to survive. Fan Xian did not want to see this, so the scene quickly spun and moved. It was as if he was sitting in front of a time machine, watching the fall of civilization, the remnants of civilization, and the remnants of the fire of civilization disappear into the wastelands. He watched as the remaining tall buildings under the snow were eroded by the wind and snow and collapsed. After the ice and snow, the weeds took over their bodies. Using the power of time, feng shui, and nature, they turned into pieces of rock and rusted gravel. None of their original appearance could be seen. He watched as the people dressed in animal skins moved back into their caves, built grass huts, and picked up bone arrows again. However, they forgot words and language. Buildings rose, buildings collapsed, and buildings rose again. In the past, Fan Xian had always thought that civilization was the existence with the most life force. No matter how great of a blow it suffered, it could always rely on a few sparks to start a new prairie fire. However, as he watched the scenes flashing quickly across the mirror, only then did he know that civilization itself was the weakest thing in the world. When the material world that civilization relied on was lost, the spiritual aspect was always so easily forgotten. The scene flashed by in an instant, but hundreds of thousands of years had already passed in this world. The last glory did not leave any trace in this world and completely disappeared. Fan Xian watched all of this happen. His eyes were confused and slightly red. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, he clenched his fists tightly. In an instant he saw 1,000 years. The stone beside him had not rotted, but tens of thousands of years had passed. He truly saw the sea turn into mulberry fields, the stars move, and the earth change. He saw the once bay become fertile soil. He didn't know if the nutrients left behind by the countless dead animals would be of any help to this change in the world. He saw the deathly grassland rise slightly after the volcanic activity calmed. Freed from the threat of the flood, a tribe of primitive people came from the northeast. They began to arduously chase away the wild animals and use slash-and-burn cultivation. After an indeterminable amount of time, a blind man covered in black cloth stepped through the ice and snow in the north and came to the tribe of ancient humans. He was called an emissary by later generations. The emissary came from the north and taught the skill of weaving nets. The people of the tribe bowed to the north and praised the favor of the gods. Another emissary came from the north and taught the method of knotting ropes to record events. The people of the tribe again praised the grace of the gods. Another emissary came from the north and taught the matter of writing. The people of the tribe built altars and painted paintings on the mountain walls. They praised the grace of the temple. Fan Xian buried his head deep into his knees. His hurried breathing made his back rise and fall. He was silent for an indeterminable amount of time. He finally understood most of the things. Ever since he confirmed that this was Earth, there were many things he did not understand. Why did the words used in this world just happen to be the words he knew in his previous life? Why did the words in this world not seem to have undergone an overly complicated process of evolution? It was as if they had been like this from the beginning. I have a question. Why is it that everything is gone, but you, or perhaps the temple, is still able to be preserved? Fan Xian's voice was very raspy. He had basically confirmed that the time of the calamity should have happened after his death. However, it could not have been too long after his death because he was unfamiliar with the construction and craftsmanship of this temple. However, in terms of technology and civilization, there was nothing he did not understand yet. On the smooth mirror of light, scenes of the tribe people's joys and sorrows continued to play out. The hot-blooded sacrifice during the opening up of the wastelands continued to play out. These remnant people who had experienced hundreds of thousands of years of cold and deathly stillness had long forgotten that they were ancient existences too far away. However, they were, after all, humans who had already evolved once. When the environment of this world allowed them to move about relatively freely, the intelligence hidden deep in the collective unconscious finally exploded. In particular, the black-clothed emissary from the north would descend upon the tribe every once in a while and bring the grace of the temple. This quickly catalyzed the progress of human society and civilization. Just like a game with a plug-in, the scene in the light mirror progressed extremely quickly. It seemed like the human race did not spend hundreds of thousands of years to develop to its present state. However, since many years ago, the black-veiled emissary had never appeared in the world again. The ones who took up this task were the emissaries who walked the world, as well as the Tianmai practitioners who were taught by those emissaries. When Fan Xian asked his question, the scene in the mirror just happened to stop on a lone peak. Countless commoners were frantically and courageously digging stone steps on the mountain. They then transported stone and wood to the summit of the mountain to build a temple there. This lonely sea was by the sea. Half of the mountain was like green jade and as smooth as a mirror. It faced the sun of the East Sea. It was the Dong Mountain that Fan Xian was very familiar with and had even personally climbed. The temple's voice once again rang out in all directions. Its tone was still warm, but there was still no hint of true emotion. For the museum's beautiful appearance to be preserved, it is all due to luck. Using the words of the people of the world, this is fate. Yes, other than fate and luck, what else could explain the ruins of a civilization from hundreds of thousands of years ago still lying quietly in the snowy mountains, calmly and warmly watching each step of the remnant people of the world? Perhaps only the eternal and unchanging ice and snow could withstand the power of time. Nature's unintentional destruction did not make the temple disappear without a trace in the long river of time like those grand buildings. The temple used solar energy. Perhaps this was one of the reasons. However, it was clear that the ancient war could not bring about such a large change in the world. Did something big happen to the earth itself? Fan Xian could have thought deeply about this question, but the emotions in his head were unusually violent, particularly when he saw the black-clothed blind emissary and the scene on the jade wall of Dong Mountain that appeared at the end. It made his mouth dry and tongue dry. He was unable to speak. If everything in the scene was true, then what was Uncle Wu Zhu? A prophet of the entire human society? A teacher? Thinking of how he had grown up with Uncle Wu Zhu and had truly lived by the side of a legend, Fan Xian's body couldn't help but tremble. But, I don't believe that you are the only place left in the world. Fan Xian's raspy voice trembled. It sounded strange. That doesn't make sense. Time can prove everything. I have spent hundreds of thousands of years in this world and have not found a similar existence. The temple's voice rang out calmly by Fan Xian's ear. The voice of the temple rang out beside Fan Xian's ear. It was very calm. For me to be able to survive until now and continue to complete my mission of helping humankind, on one hand, is luck. On the other hand, during these hundreds of thousands of years, the emissaries have been endlessly repairing the temple. Unfortunately, the emissaries have gradually been used up by time. Although the temple's voice said it was a pity, there was no such emotion in its tone. Fan Xian closed his eyes and thought deeply for a long time. He then pointed at the great Dong Mountain in the mirror and the temple that was gradually being completed. I've been to this place before. Why did you send out a prophecy through the emissaries and build a temple there? As he passed by Dong Mountain from the sea, each time he saw the neat and tidy jade wall that seemed to have been cut by a god's sword, Fan Xian's state of mind would waver. Looking at the impossible scene in this world, he always felt that the jade wall did not seem to be formed naturally. If it was done by a human, what kind of power did it take? What Fan Xian didn't understand the most was why Uncle Wu Zhu had gone to Dong Mountain to recover after he was injured. Why did the emperor choose Dong Mountain for his final battle? To commemorate. The temple's voice was silent for a moment. It then said, that was the starting point of the battle. It was the weapon that humans used to kill each other. In the end, it created a result that even humans themselves could not have predicted. As for the final imprint, it was that neat and tidy jade wall. That city had long ceased to exist. Half of that mountain had been melted by the heat. In the end it became what it is now. Fan Xian closed his eyes tightly. His eyelashes trembled slightly. It was not until today that he learned of this secret. Dong Mountain had been the point of the battle. A mountain range had been melted into a lone peak hanging by the ocean. The rocks had been melted by the high temperature into a green jade wall. How exaggerated and terrifying was this? Thus, the radiation left behind on Dong Mountain is the most powerful. It is also the most powerful yuan-chi in the world. Fan Xian's raspy voice rang out as he spoke of his deduction. If my deduction is correct, I don't understand why the radiation from killing people can become yuan-chi in the world. If the people of the world are truly the remains of a previous generation of humans, why do they have things like meridians in their bodies? Because humans are the stupidest species in the world and also the smartest. Most importantly, they are the species most able to adapt to their environment, the temple's voice replied. Concerning this, I have absolute confidence. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.